But I wonder, can I trust you? No. If you could, I wouldn't be much suited to the task, would I? He caught hold of her trailing finger and twisted it towards him, dragged her wincing face close. What's in it for you? There's a man in the Union. The man I work for. The one who sent me to Styria in the first place to spy on Orso. The cripple? Vitari had said the name. The man who stood behind the King of the Union. Yes. She squealed as he twisted her finger further. Then he let it go, and she snatched it back, holding it to her chest, bottom lip stuck out at him. You didn't have to do that. Maybe I enjoyed doing it. Go on. When Makato made me betray Orso, she made me betray the cripple too. Orso I can live with as an enemy, if I must, but not this cripple. She swallowed. No, not him. A worse enemy than the great Duke Orso, eh? Far worse. Mercato is his price. She threatens to rip apart all his carefully woven plans to bring Tarlins into the Union. He wants her dead. The smooth mask had slipped, and she had this look, shoulders slumped, staring down wide-eyed at the sheet. Hungry and sick and very, very scared. Chivers liked seeing it. Might have been the first honest look he'd seen since he landed in Styria. If I can find a way to kill her, I get my life, she whispered. And I'm your way. She looked back up at him, and her eyes were hard. Can you do it? I could have done it today. He'd thought of splitting her head with his axe. He'd thought of planting his boot on her face and shoving her under the water. Then she'd have had to respect him. But instead he'd saved her, because he'd been hoping. Maybe he still was. But hoping had made a fool of him, and Shivers was good and sick of looking the fool. How many men had he killed? In all those battles, skirmishes, desperate fights up in the north. Just in the half-year since he came to Styria, even. At Cardotti's, in the smoke and the madness. Among the statues in Duke Salia's palace. In the battle just a few hours back. It might have been a score, more. And women among them. He was steeped in blood, deep as the Bloody Nine himself. Didn't seem likely that adding one more to the tally would cost him a place among the righteous. His mouth twisted. I could do it. It was plain as the scar on his face that Monza cared nothing for him. Why should he care anything for her? I could do it easily. Then do it. She crept forwards on her hands and knees, mouth half open, pale tits hanging heavy, looking him right in his one eye. For me. Her nipples brushed against his chest, one way, then the other, as she crawled over him. For you. Her necklace of blood-red stones clicked gently against his chin. For us. I'll need to pick my moment. He slid his hand down her back and up onto her arse. Caution first, eh? Of course. Nothing done well is ever rushed. His head was full of her scent, sweet smell of flowers mixed with the sharp smell of fucking. She owes me money, he growled, the last objection. Money. I used to be a merchant, you know, buying, selling. Her breath was hot on his neck, on his mouth, on his face. And in my long experience, when people begin to talk prices, the deal is already done. She nuzzled at him, lips brushing the massive scar down his cheek. Do this thing for me, and I promise you'll get all you could ever spend. The cool tip of her tongue lapped gently at the raw flesh round his metal eye, sweet and soothing. I have an arrangement the banking house of Wellington Bulk. So much for nothing. Silver gleamed in the sunlight with that special mouth-watering twinkle that somehow only money has. A whole strongbox full of it, stacked in plain sight, drawing the eyes of every man in the camp more surely than if a naked countess had been sprawled suggestively upon the table. Piles of sparkling coins freshly minted. Some of the cleanest currency in Styria, pressed into some of its grubbiest hands. A pleasing irony. The coins carried the scales on one side, of course, traditional symbol of Styrian commerce since the time of the New Empire. On the other, the stern profile of Grand Duke Orso of Talins. An even more pleasing irony, to Koska's mind, that he was paying the men of the Thousand Swords with the face of the man they had but lately betrayed. In a pocked and spattered, squinting and scratching, coughing and slovenly line, the soldiers and staff of the 1st Company of the 1st Regiment of the Thousand Swords passed by the makeshift table to receive their unjust deserts. They were closely supervised by the chief notary of the brigade and a dozen of its most reliable veterans, which was just as well, because during the course of the morning, Koska had witnessed every dispiriting trick imaginable. Men approached the table on multiple occasions in different clothes, giving false names or those of dead comrades. They routinely exaggerated, embellished, or flat-out lied in regards to rank or length of service. They wept for sick mothers, children, or acquaintances. They delivered a devastating volley of complaints about food, drink, equipment, runny shits, superiors, the smell of other men, the weather, items stolen, injuries suffered, injuries given, perceived slights on non-existent honor, and on and on and on. Had they demonstrated the same audacity and persistence in combat that they did in trying to prize the slightest dishonest pittance from their commander, they would have been the greatest fighting force of all time. But First Sergeant Friendly was watching. He had worked for years in the kitchens of safety, where dozens of the world's most infamous swindlers vied daily with each other for enough bread to survive, and so he knew every low trick, con, and stratagem practiced this side of hell. There was no sliding around his basilisk gaze. The convict did not permit a single shining portrait of Duke Orso to be administered out of turn. Koska shook his head in deep dismay as he watched the last man trudge away, the unbearable limp for which he had demanded compensation miraculously healed. By the fates, you would have thought they'd be glad of the bonus. It isn't as if they had to fight for it, or even steal it themselves. I swear, the more you give a man, the more he demands, and the less happy he becomes. No one ever appreciates what he gets for nothing. A pox on charity. He slapped the notary on the shoulder, causing him to scrawl an untidy line across his carefully kept page. Mercenaries aren't all they used to be, grumbled the man as he sourly blotted it. No, to my eye they seem very much as violent-tempered and mean-spirited as ever. Things aren't what they used to be is the rallying cry of small minds. When men say things used to be better, they invariably mean they were better for them, because they were young and had all their hopes intact. The world is bound to look a darker place as you slide into the grave. So, everything stays the same? Asked the notary, looking sadly up. Some men get better, some get worse. Koska heaved a weighty sigh. But on the grand scale, I have observed no significant changes. How many of our heroes have we paid now? That's all of Squire's company of Andisha's regiment. Well, Andisha's regiment that was. Koska put a hand over his eyes. Please, don't speak of that brave heart. His loss still stabs at me. How many have we paid? The notary licked his fingers, flipped over a couple of crackling leaves of his ledger, started counting the entries. 1, 2, 3.
404,
said Friendly. And how many persons in the 1,000 swords? The notary winced. Counting all ancillaries, servants and tradesmen? Absolutely. Horse, too? Counting them first. They're the hardest workers in the whole damn brigade. The lawyer squinted skywards.
12,819,
said Friendly. Koska stared at him. I've heard it said a good sergeant is worth 3 generals, but you may well be worth 3 dozen, my friend. 13,000, though. We'll be here tomorrow night still. Very likely, grumbled the notary, flipping over the page. Krapstein's company of Andish's regiment will be next. Andish's regiment, as was, that is. Koska unscrewed the cap of the flask Morvir had thrown at him in Sapani, raised it to his lips, shook it, and realized it was empty. He frowned at the battered metal bottle, remembering with some discomfort the poisoner's sneering assertion that a man never changes. So much discomfort, in fact, that his need for a drink was sharply increased. A brief interlude while I obtain a refill. Get Krapstein's company lined up. He stood, grimacing as his aching knees crunched into life, then cracked a smile. A large man was walking steadily towards him through the mud, smoke, canvas, and confusion of the camp. Why, Master Shivers from the cold and bloody north. The Northman had evidently given up on fine dressing, wearing a leather jack and rough-spun shirt with sleeves rolled to the elbows. His hair, neat as any Massalian dandy's when Koska first laid eyes upon the man, had grown back to an unkempt tangle, heavy jaw fuzzed with a growth between beard and stubble. None of it did anything to disguise the massive scar covering one side of his face. It would take more than hair to hide that. My old partner in adventure, or murder, as was in fact the case. You have a twinkle in your eye. Literally, he did, for bright metal in the Northman's empty socket was catching the noon sun and shining with almost painful brightness. You look well, my friend, most well, though he looked, in fact, a mutilated savage. Happy face, happy heart. The Northman showed a lopsided smile, burned flesh shifting only by the smallest margin. Quite so. Have a smile for breakfast, you'll be shitting joy by lunch. Were you in the battle? That I was. I thought as much. You've never struck me as a man afraid to roll up his sleeves. Bloody, was it? That it was. Some men thrive on blood, though, eh? I dare say you've known a few who were that way. That I have. And where is your employer, my infamous pupil, replacement and predecessor, General Makato? Behind you, came a sharp voice. He spun about. God's teeth, woman, but you haven't lost the knack of creeping up on a man. He pretended at shock to smother the sentimental welling up that always accompanied her appearance, and threatened to make his voice crack with emotion. She had a long scratch down one cheek, some bruising on her face, but otherwise looked well. Very well. My joy to see you alive knows no bounds, of course. He swept off his hat, feather drooping apologetically, and kneeled in the dirt in front of her. Say you forgive my theatrics. You see now, I was thinking only of you all along. My fondness for you is undiminished. She snorted at that. Fondness, eh? More than she could ever know, or he would ever tell her. So, this pantomime was for my benefit. I may swoon with gratitude. One of your most endearing features was always your readiness to swoon. He cranked himself back up to standing. A consequence of your sensitive, womanly heart, I suppose. Walk with me. I have something to show you. He led her off through the trees towards the farmhouse, its whitewashed walls gleaming in the midday sun, friendly and shivers trailing them like bad memories. I must confess that, as well as doing you a favour, and the sore temptation of placing my boot in Orso's arse at long last, there were some trifling issues of personal gain to consider. Some things never change. Nothing ever does, and why should it? A considerable quantity of Gurkish gold was on offer. Well, you know it was. You were the first to offer it. Oh, and Rogont was kind enough to promise me, in the now highly likely event that he is crowned King of Styria, the Grand Duchy of Visserine. He was deeply satisfied by her gasp of surprise. You? Grand fucking Duke of Visserine? I probably won't use the word fucking on my decrees, but otherwise, correct. Grand Duke Nicomo sounds rather well, no? After all, Salia is dead. That much I know. He had no heirs, not even distant ones. The city was plundered, devastated by fire. Its government collapsed, much of the populace fled, killed, or otherwise taken advantage of. Visserine is in need of a strong and selfless leader to restore her to her glories. And instead they'll have you. He allowed himself a chuckle. But who better suited? Am I not a native of Visserine? A lot of people are. You don't see them helping themselves to its dukedom. Well, there's only one, and it's mine. Why do you even want it? Commitments? Responsibilities? I thought you hated all that. I always thought so, but my wandering star led me only to the gutter. I have not had a productive life, Monscaro. You don't say. I have frittered my gifts away on nothing. Self-pity and self-hatred have led me by unsavory paths to self-neglect, self-injury, and the very brink of self-destruction. The unifying theme? Yourself? Precisely so. Vanity, Monza. Self-obsession. The mark of infancy. I need, for my own sake and those of my fellow men, to be an adult. To turn my talents outwards. It is just as you always tried to tell me. The time comes when a man has to stick. What better way than to commit myself wholeheartedly to the service of the city of my birth? Your wholehearted commitment? Alas for the poor city of Visserine. They'll do better than they did with that art-thieving gourmand. Now they'll have an all-thieving drunk. You misjudge me, Monscaro. A man can change. I thought you just said nothing ever does. Changed my mind. And why not? In one day, I bagged myself a fortune and one of the richest dukedoms in Styria, too. She shook her head in combined disgust and amazement. And all you did was sit here. Therein lies the real trick. Anyone can earn rewards. Koska tipped his head back, smiled up at the black branches and the blue sky beyond them. Do you know, I think it highly unlikely that ever in history has one man gained so much for doing absolutely nothing. But I am hardly the only one to profit from yesterday's exploits. Grand Duke Rogont, I dare say, is happy with the outcome. And you are a great stride nearer to your grand revenge, are you not? He leaned close to her. Speaking of which, I have a gift for you. She frowned at him, ever suspicious. What gift? I would hate to spoil the surprise. Sergeant Friendly, could you take your ex-employer and her northern companion into the house and show her what we found yesterday? For her to do with as she pleases, of course. He turned away with a smirk. We're all friends now.
In here.
Friendly pushed the low door creaking open. Monza gave Shivers a look. He shrugged back. She ducked under the lintel and into the dim room, cool after the sun outside, with a ceiling of vaulted brick and patches of light across a dusty stone floor. As her eyes adjusted to the gloom, she saw a figure wedged into the furthest corner. He shuffled forwards, chain between his ankles rattling faintly. and criss-cross shadows from the grubby window panes fell across one half of his face. Prince Foscar, Duke Orso's younger son. Monza felt her whole body stiffen. It seemed he'd finally grown up since she last saw him, running from his father's hall in Fontesamo, wailing that he wanted no part in her murder. He'd lost the fluff on his top lip, gained a bloom of bruises ringing one eye, and swapped the apologetic look for a fearful one. He stared at Shivers, then at Friendly, as they stepped through into the room behind her. Not two men to give a prisoner hope, on the whole. He met Monza's eye, finally, reluctantly, with the haunted look of a man who knows what's coming.
"It's true, then,"
he whispered.
"You're alive."
"Unlike your brother. I stabbed him through his throat, then threw him out of the window." The sharp knobble in Foscar's neck bobbed up and down as he swallowed. "I had Malthus poisoned. Ganmark run through with a ton of bronze. Faithfuls stabbed, slashed, drowned, and hung from a water wheel. Still turning on it, for all I know. Gobber was lucky. I only smashed his hands and his knees and his skull to bone meal with a hammer." The list gave her grim nausea rather than grim satisfaction, but she forced her way through it. "Of the 7 men who were in that room when they murdered Benner, there's just your father left." She slid the Calvez from its sheath, the gentle scraping of the blade as ugly as a child's scream. "Your father and you." The room was close, stale. Friendly's face was empty as a corpse's. Shivers leaned back against the wall beside her, arms folded, grinning.
"I understand."
Foscar came closer, small, unwilling steps, but towards her still. He stopped no more than a stride away and sank to his knees, awkwardly, since his hands were tied behind him. The whole time his eyes were on hers.
"I'm sorry."
"You're fucking sorry?" she squeezed through gritted teeth.
"I didn't know what was going to happen. I loved Benner."
His lip trembled, a tear ran down the side of his face. Fear or guilt or both.
"Your brother was like a brother to me. I would never have wanted that for either of you. I'm sorry for my part in it."
He'd had no part in it. She knew that.
I want to live."
So did Benner.
"Please."
More tears trickled, leaving glistening trails down his cheeks.
"I just want to live."
Her stomach churned, acid burning her throat and washing up into her watering mouth. Do it. She'd come all this way to do it, suffered all this, and made all those others suffer, just so she could do it. Her brother would have had no doubts, not then. She could almost hear his voice. Do what you have to. Conscience is an excuse. Mercy and cowardice are the same. It was time to do it. He had to die. Do it now. But her stiff arm seemed to weigh 1,000 tons. She stared at Foscar's ashen face, his big, wide, helpless eyes. Something about him reminded her of Benner, when he was young, before Capril, before Sweet Pines, before they betrayed Cosca, before they joined up with the 1,000 Swords even. When she'd wanted just to make things grow. Long ago, that boy laughing in the wheat. The point of the Calvez wobbled, dropped, tapped against the floor. Foscar took a long, shuddering breath, closed his eyes, then opened them again, wet, glistening in the corners.
"Thank you. I always knew you had a heart, whatever they said. Thank—"
Shivers' big fist crunched into his face and knocked him on his back, blood bubbling from his broken nose. He got out a shocked splutter before the Northman was on top of him, hands closing tight around his throat. You wanna fucking live, eh? Hissed Shivers, teeth bared in a snarling grin, the sinews squirming in his forearms as he squeezed tighter and tighter. Foscar kicked helplessly, struggled silently, twisted his shoulders, face turning pink, then red, then purple. Shivers dragged up Foscar's head with both his hands, lifted it towards him, close enough to kiss almost, then rammed it down against the stone flags with a sharp crack. Foscar's boots jerked, the chain between them rattling. Shivers worked his head to one side, then the other, as he shifted his hands around Foscar's neck for a better grip, tendons standing stark from their scabbed backs. He dragged him up again, no hurry, and rammed his head back down with a dull crunch. Foscar's tongue lolled out, one eyelid flickering, black blood creeping down from his hairline. Shivers growled something in Northern, words she couldn't understand, lifted Foscar's head, smashed it down with all the care of a stonemason getting the details right. Again and again. Monza watched, her mouth half open, still holding weakly onto her sword, doing nothing. Not sure what she could do, or should do, whether to stop him or help him. Blood dashed the rendered walls and the stone flags in spots and spatters. Over the pop and crackle of shattering bone, she could hear a voice. Benner's voice, she thought for a minute, still whispering at her to do it. Then she realized it was friendly, calmly counting the number of times Foscar's skull had been smashed into the stones. He got up to 11. Shivers lifted the prince's mangled head once more, hair all matted, glistening black. Then he blinked and let it drop. Reckon that's got it. He came slowly up to standing, one boot planted on either side of Foscar's corpse. He looked at his hands, looked around for something to wipe them on, ended up rubbing them together, smearing black streaks of blood dry brown to his elbows. One more to the good. He looked sideways at her with his one eye, corner of his mouth curled up in a sick smile. 6 out of 7. Hey, Monza?
6 and 1.
Friendly grunted to himself. All turning out just like you hoped. She stared down at Foscar, flattened head twisted sideways, crossed eyes goggling up at the wall, blood spreading out across the stone floor in a black puddle from his broken skull. Her voice seemed to come from a long way off, reedy thin. Why did you? Why not? Whispered Shivers, coming close. She saw her own pale, scabbed, pinched-in face reflected, bent and twisted in that dead metal ball of an eye. What we came here for, innit? What we fought for all the day down in the mud. I thought you was all for never turning back. Mercy and cowardice the same and all that hard talk you gave me. By the dead, Chief! He grinned, the massive scar across his face squirming and puckering, his good cheek all dotted with red. I could almost swear you ain't half the evil bitch you pretend to be. Shifting sands. With the greatest of care not to attract undue attention, Morvier insinuated himself into the back of Duke Orso's great audience chamber. For such a vast and impressive room, it numbered but a few occupants, perhaps a function of the difficult circumstances in which the great man found himself. Having catastrophically lost the most important battle in the history of Styria was bound to discourage visitors. Still, Morvier had always been drawn to employers in difficult circumstances. They tended to pay handsomely. The Grand Duke of Talins was, without doubt, still a majestic presence. He sat upon a gilded chair on a high dais, all in sable velvet trimmed with gold, and frowned down with regal fury over the shining helmets of half a dozen no less furious guardsmen. He was flanked by two men who could not have been more polar opposites. On the left, a plump, ruddy-faced old fellow stood with a respectful but painful-looking bend to his hips, gold buttons about his chubby throat fastened to the point of uncomfortable tightness and, indeed, considerably beyond. He had, ill-advisedly, attempted to conceal his utter and obvious baldness by combing back and forth a few sad strands of wiry grey hair, cultivated to enormous length for this precise purpose. Orso's Chamberlain. On the right, a curly-haired young man slouched with unexpected ease in travel-stained clothes, resting upon what appeared to be a long stick. Morvier had the frustrating sensation of having seen him somewhere before, but could not place him, and his relationship to the Duke was, for now, a slightly worrying mystery. The only other occupant of the chamber had his well-dressed back to Morvier, prostrate upon one knee on the strip of crimson carpet, clutching his hat in one hand. Even from the very back of the hall, the gleaming sheen of sweat across his bald patch was most evident. "What help from my son-in-law?" Orso was demanding in stentorian tones. "The High King of the Union?" The voice of the ambassador, for it appeared to be none other, had the whine of a well-whipped dog expecting further punishment. "Your son-in-law sends his earnest regrets." "Indeed, but no soldiers. What would he have me do, shoot his regrets at my enemies?" "His armies are all committed in our unfortunate northern wars, and a revolt in the city of Rostad causes further difficulties. The nobles, meanwhile, are reluctant. The peasantry are again restless. The merchants are behind on their payments. I see. If excuses were soldiers, he would have sent a mighty throng indeed." "He is beset by troubles." "He is beset? He is? Are his sons murdered? Are his soldiers butchered? Are his hopes all in ruins?" The ambassador wrung his hands. "Your Excellency, he is spread thin. His regrets have no end, but his help has no beginning. High King of the Union, a fine talker and a goodly smile when the sun is up, but when the clouds come in, look not for shelter in Adua, eh? My intervention on his behalf was timely, was it not, when the Gurkish horde clamored at his gates? But now I need his help. Forgive me, father, I am spread thin." "Out of my sight, bastard, before your master's regrets cost you your tongue. Out of my sight, and tell the cripple that I see his hand in this. Tell him I will whip the price from his twisted hide." The Grand Duke's furious screams echoed out over the hurried footsteps of the ambassador, edging backwards as quickly as he dared, bowing profusely and sweating even more. "Tell him I will be revenged." The ambassador genuflected his way past Morvier, and the double doors were heaved booming shut upon him. "Who is that, skulking at the back of the chamber?" Orso's voice was no more reassuring for its sudden calmness, quite the reverse. Morvier swallowed as he processed down the blood-red strip of carpet. Orso's eye held a look of the most withering command. It reminded Morvier unpleasantly of his meeting with the headmaster of the orphanage when he was called to account for the dead birds. His ears burned with shame and horror at the memory of that interview, more even than his legs burned at the memory of his punishment. He swept out his lowest and most sycophantic bow, unfortunately spoiling the effect by rapping his knuckles against the floor in his nervousness. "This is one Castor Morvier, Your Excellency. intoned the Chamberlain, peering down his bulbous nose. Orso leaned forwards. And what manner of a man is Castor Morvier?
A poisoner.
Master poisoner, corrected Morvier. He could be as obsequious as the next man when it was required, but he flatly insisted on his proper title. Had he not earned it, after all, with sweat, danger, deep wounds, both physical and emotional, long study, short mercy, and many, many painful reverses? Master, is it? Sneered Orso. And what great notables have you poisoned to earn the prefix? Morvier permitted himself the faintest of smiles. Grand Duchess Cephaline of Austria, Your Excellency. Count Bernardi of Etrea, and both his sons, though their boat subsequently sank and they were never found. Ghassan Maz, satrap of Kadir, and then, when further problems presented themselves, his successor, Zuvan Yinsol. Old Lord Isher of Midderland, he was one of mine. Prince Amrit, who would have been heir to the throne of Muris, I understood he died of natural causes. What could be a more natural death for a powerful man than a dose of leopard flower administered into the ear by a dangling thread? Then Admiral Brandt, late of the Murician fleet, and his wife. His cabin boy, too, alas, who happened by, a young life cut regrettably short. I would hate to prevail upon Your Excellency's valuable time. The list is long indeed, most distinguished and entirely dead. With your permission, I will add only the most recent name upon it. Orso gave the most minute inclination of his head, sneering no longer, Morvier was pleased to note. One Malthus, head of the Westport office of the banking house of Valentin Bulk. The Duke's face had gone blank as a stone slab. Who was your employer for that last? I make it a point of professionalism never to mention the names of my employers, but I believe these are exceptional circumstances. I was hired by none other than Monscaro Mercato, the butcher of Capril. His blood was up now, and he could not resist a final flourish. I believe you are acquainted? Somewhat, whispered Orso. The Duke's dozen guards stirred ominously, as if controlled directly by their master's mood. Morvier became aware that he might have gone a flourish too far, felt his bladder weaken, and was forced to press his knees together. You infiltrated the offices of Valentin Bulk in Westport? Indeed, croaked Morvier. Orso glanced sideways at the man with the curly hair. I congratulate you on the achievement, though it has been the cause of some considerable discomfort to me and my associates. Pray explain why I should not have you killed for it. Morvier attempted to pass it off with a vivacious chuckle, but it died a slow death in the chilly vastness of the hall. I, had no notion, of course, that you were in any way to be discomforted. None. Really, it was all due to a regrettable failing, or indeed a willful oversight, deliberate dishonesty, a lie, even, on the part of my cursed assistant, that I took the job in the first place. I should never have trusted that greedy bitch. He realized he was doing himself no good by blaming the dead. Great men want living people to hold responsible, that they might have them tortured, hanged, beheaded, and so forth. Corpses offer no recompense. He swiftly changed tack. I was but the tool, Your Excellency, merely the weapon. A weapon I now offer for your own hand to wield as you see fit. He bowed again, even lower this time, muscles in his rump, already sore from climbing the cursed mountainside to Fontesamo, trembling in their efforts to prevent him from pitching on his face. You seek a new employer. Makato proved as treacherous towards me as she did towards your illustrious lordship. The woman is a snake indeed, twisting, poisonous, and scaly, he finished lamely. I was lucky to escape her toxic clutches with my life, and now seek redress. I am prepared to seek it most earnestly, and will not be denied. Redress would be a fine thing for us all, murmured the man with the curly hair. News of Makato's survival spreads through Talons like wildfire, papers bearing her face on every wall. A fact, Morvier had seen them as he passed through the city. They say you stabbed her through the heart, but she lived, Your Excellency. The Duke snorted. Had I stabbed her, I would never have aimed for her heart. Without doubt, her least vulnerable organ. They say you burned her, drowned her, cut her into quarters and tossed them from your balcony, but she was stitched back together and lived again. They say she killed 200 men at the fords of the Salva, that she charged alone into your ranks and scattered them like chaff on the wind. The stamp of Rogant's theatrics, hissed the Duke through gritted teeth. That bastard was born to be an author of cheap fantasies rather than a ruler of men. We will hear next that Makato has sprouted wings and given birth to the second coming of Eos. I wouldn't be at all surprised. Bills are posted on every street corner proclaiming her an instrument of the fates, sent to deliver Styria from your tyranny. Tyrant now! The Duke barked a grim chuckle. How quickly the wind shifts in the modern age. They say she cannot be killed. Do they, indeed? Orso's red-rimmed eyes swiveled to Morvier. What do you say, poisoner? Your Excellency. And he plunged down into the lowest of bows once more. I have fashioned a successful career upon the principle that there is nothing that lives that cannot be deprived of life. It is the remarkable ease of killing, rather than the impossibility of it, that has always caused me astonishment. Do you care to prove it? Your Excellency, I humbly entreat only the opportunity. Morvier swept out another bow. It was his considered opinion that one could never bow too much to men of Orso's stamp, though he did reflect that persons of huge ego were a great drain on the patience of bystanders. Then here it is. Kill Monscaro Makato. Kill Nicomo Koska. Kill Countess Cotader of Afoya. Kill Duke Lerozio of Puranti. Kill First Citizen Patine of Nicanti. Kill Chancellor Sartorius of Sipani. Kill Grand Duke Rogant before he can be crowned. Perhaps I will not have Styria, but I will have revenge. On that you can depend. Morvier had been warmly smiling as the list began. By its end, he was smiling no longer, unless one could count the fixed rictus he maintained across his trembling face only by the very greatest of efforts. It appeared his bold gambit had spectacularly over-succeeded. He was forcibly reminded of his attempt to discomfort 4 of his tormentors at the orphanage by placing lankum salts in the water, which had ended, of course, with the untimely deaths of all the establishment staff and most of the children, too. Your Excellency, he croaked, that is a significant quantity of murder. And some fine names for your little list, no? The rewards will be equally significant, on that you can rely. Will they not, Master Sulphur? They will. Sulphur's eyes moved from his fingernails to Morvier's face. Different-colored eyes, Morvier now noticed, one green, one blue. I represent, you see, the banking house of Valentin Bulk. Ah! Suddenly, and with profound discomfort, Morvier placed the man. He had seen him talking with Malthus in the banking hall in Westport, but a few short days before he had filled the place with corpses. Ah, I really had not the slightest notion, you understand. How he wished now that he had not killed Day. Then he could have noisily denounced her as the culprit and had something tangible with which to furnish the Duke's dungeons. Fortunately, it seemed Master Sulphur was not seeking scapegoats yet. Oh, you were but the weapon, as you say. If you can cut us sharply on our behalf, you have nothing to worry about. And besides, Malthus was a terrible bore. Shall we say, if you are successful, the sum of 1 million scales? 1 million? Muttered Morvier. There is nothing that lives that cannot be deprived of life. Orso leaned forwards, eyes fixed on Morvier's face. Now get about it! Night was falling when they came to the place, lamps lit in the grimy windows, stars spilled out across the soft night sky like diamonds on a jeweller's cloth. Schenkt had never liked a foyer. He had studied there as a young man before he ever knelt to his master and before he swore never to kneel again. He had fallen in love there, with a woman too rich, too old, and far too beautiful for him, and been made a whining fool of. The streets were lined not only with old pillars and thirsty palms, but with the bitter remnants of his childish shame, jealousy, weeping injustice. Strange that however tough one's skin becomes in later life, the wounds of youth never close. Schenkt did not like a foyer, but the trail had led him here. It would take more than ugly memories to make him leave a job half done. That is the house? It was buried in the twisting back streets of the city's oldest quarter, far from the thoroughfares where the names of men seeking public office were daubed on the walls, along with their great qualities and other less complimentary words and pictures. A small building with slumping lintels and a slumping roof, squeezed between a warehouse and a leaning shed. That's the house. The beggar's voice was soft and stinking as rotten fruit. Good. Schenkt pressed 5 scales into his scabby palm. This is for you. He closed the man's fist around the money, then held it with his own. Never come back here. He leaned closer, squeezed harder. Not ever. He slipped across the cobbled street, over the wall before the house. His heart was beating unusually fast, sweat prickling his scalp. He crept across the overgrown front garden, old boots finding the silent spaces between the weeds, and to the lighted window. Reluctant, almost afraid, he peered through. 3 children sat on a worn red carpet beside a small fire. 2 girls and a boy, all with the same orange hair. They were playing with a brightly painted wooden horse on wheels, clambering onto it, pushing each other around on it, pushing each other off it to faint squeals of amusement. He squatted there, fascinated, and watched them. Innocent, unformed, full of possibilities. Before they began to make their choices, or had their choices made for them. Before the doors began to close and sent them down the only remaining path. Before they knelt. Now, for this briefest spell, they could be anything. Wow, wow! What have we here? She was crouching above him on the low roof of the shed, her head on one side, a line of light from a window across the way, cutting hard down her face, strip of spiky red hair, red eyebrow, narrowed eye, freckled skin, corner of a frowning mouth. A chain hung gleaming down from one fist, cross of sharpened metal swinging gently on the end of it. Schenk sighed. It seems you have the better of me. She slid from the wall, dropped to the dirt, and thumped smoothly down on her haunches, chain rattling. She stood, tall and lean, and took a step towards him, raising her hand. He breathed in, slow, slow. He saw every detail of her face. Lines, freckles, faint hairs on her top lip, sandy eyelashes crawling down as she blinked. He could hear her heart beating, heavy as a ram at a gate. Thump, thump, thump. She slid her hand around his head, and they kissed. He wrapped his arms about her, pressed her thin body tight against him. She tangled her fingers in his hair, chain brushing against his shoulders, dangling metal knocking lightly against the backs of his legs. A long, gentle, lingering kiss that made his body tingle from his lips to his toes. She broke away. It's been a while, Cass. I know. Too long. I know. She nodded towards the window. They miss you. Can I? You know you can. She led him to the door, into the narrow hallway, unbuckling the chain from her wrist and slinging it over a hook, cross-shaped knife dangling. The oldest girl dashed out from the room, stopped dead when she saw him. It's me. He edged slowly towards her, his voice strangled. It's me. The other two children came out from the room, peering around their sister. Schenk feared no man, but before these children he was a coward. I have something for you. He reached into his coat with trembling fingers. Cass? He held out the carved dog, and the little boy with his name snatched it from his hand, grinning. Kanda? He put the bird in the cupped hands of the littlest girl, and she stared dumbly at it. For you, T. And he offered the cat to the oldest girl. She took it. No one calls me that anymore. I'm sorry, it's been so long. He touched the girl's hair, and she flinched away. He jerked his hand back, awkward. He felt the weight of the butcher's sickle in his coat as he moved, and he stood sharply, took a step back. The three of them stared up at him, carved animals clutched in their hands. To bed now, said Shiloh. He'll still be here tomorrow. Her eyes were on him, hard lines across the freckled bridge of her nose. Won't you, Cass? Yes. She brushed their complaints away, pointed to the stairs. To bed! They filed up slowly, step by step, the boy yawning, the younger girl hanging her head, the other complaining that she wasn't tired. I'll come sing to you later. If you're quiet until then, maybe your father will even hum the low parts. The youngest of the two girls smiled at him between the banisters at the top of the stairs, until Shiloh pushed him into the living room and shut the door. They got so big, he muttered. That's what they do. Why are you here? Can't I just... You know you can, and you know you haven't. Why are you... She saw the ruby on his forefinger and frowned. That's Makato's ring. She lost it in Puranti. I nearly caught her there. Caught her? Why? He paused. She has become involved in my revenge. You and your revenge? Did you ever think you might be happier forgetting it? A rock might be happier if it was a bird and could fly from the earth and be free. A rock is not a bird. Were you working for Makato? Yes. So? Where is she? You came here for that? That? He looked towards the ceiling. And them? He looked her in the eye. And you? She grinned, little lines cutting into the skin at the corners of her eyes. It took him by surprise how much he loved to see those lines. Cass, for such a clever bastard, you're a stupid bastard. You always look for all the wrong things in all the wrong places. Mikato's in Austria with Rogont. She fought in the battle there. Any man with ears knows that. I didn't hear. You don't listen. She's tight with the Duke of Delay now. My guess is he'll be putting her in Orso's place. Keep the people of Tarlins alongside when he reaches for the crown. Then she'll be following him, back to Tarlins. That's right. Then I will follow them, back to Tarlins. Schenkt frowned. I could have stayed there these past weeks and simply waited for her. That's what happens if you're always chasing things. Works better if you wait for what you want to come to you. I was sure you'd have found another man by now. I found a couple. They didn't stick. She held out her hand to him. You ready to hum? Always. He took her hand, and she pulled him from the room, and through the door, and up the stairs. Part 7. Tarlins. Revenge is a dish best served cold. Pierre Chaudelot de Laclos. Rogont of Austria was late to the field at Sweet Pines, but Salia of Visserine still enjoyed the weight of numbers and was too proud to retreat, especially when the enemy was commanded by a woman. He fought, he lost, he ended up retreating anyway, and left the city of Capriel defenseless. Rather than face a certain sack, the citizens opened their gates to the Serpent of Tarlins in the hope of mercy. Monza rode in, but most of her men she left outside. Orso had made allies of the Baelish, convinced them to fight with the 1,000 swords under their ragged standards. Fierce fighters, but with a bloody reputation. Monza had a bloody reputation of her own, and that only made her trust them less. I love you. Of course you do. I love you, but keep the Baelish out of town, Benna. You can trust me. I do trust you. Keep the Baelish out of town. She rode 3 hours as the sun went down, back to the rotting battlefield at Sweet Pines, to dine with Duke Orso and learn his plans for the close of the season. Mercy for the citizens of Capriel, if they yield to me entirely, pay indemnities, and acknowledge me their rightful ruler. Mercy, Your Excellency? You know what it is, yes? She knew what it was. She had not thought he did. I want their land, not their lives. Dead men cannot obey. You have won a famous victory here. You shall have a great triumph, a procession through the streets of Tarlins. That would please Benner, at least. Your Excellency is too kind. Ha! Few would agree with that. She laughed as she rode back in the cool dawn, and Faithful laughed beside her. They talked of how rich the soil was on the banks of the Capra, watching the good wheat shift in the wind. Then she saw the smoke above the city, and she knew. The streets were full of dead. Men, women, children, young and old. Birds gathered on them, flies swarmed. A confused dog limped along beside their horses. Nothing else living showed itself. Empty windows gaped, empty doorways yawned. Fires still burned, whole rows of houses, nothing but ash and tottering chimney stacks. Last night, a thriving city. This morning, Capriel was hell made real. It seemed Benna had not been listening. The Baelish had begun it, but the rest of the 1,000 swords, drunk, angry, fearing they would miss out on the easy pickings, had eagerly joined in. Darkness and dark company made it easy for even half-decent men to behave like animals, and there were few half-decent men among the scum Monza commanded. The boundaries of civilization are not the impregnable walls civilized men take them for. As easily as smoke on the wind, they can dissolve. Monza flopped down from her horse and puked Duke Orso's fine breakfast over the rubbish-strewn cobbles.
Not your fault,
said Faithful, one big hand on her shoulder. She shook him off. I know that. But her rebellious guts thought otherwise.
As the years of blood, Monzer, this is what we are.
Up the steps to the house they'd taken, tongue rough with sick. Benner lay on the bed, fast asleep, husk pipe near one hand. She dragged him up, made him squawk, cuffed him one way and the other. Keep them out of town, I told you! And she forced him to the window, forced him to look down into the blood-stained street. I didn't know. I told Victus, I think. He slid to the floor and wept, and her anger leaked away and left her empty. Her fault for leaving him in charge. She could not let him shoulder the blame. He was a good man and sensitive, and would not have borne it well. There was nothing she could do but kneel beside him and hold him and whisper soothing words while the flies buzzed outside the window. Orso wants to give us a triumph. Soon afterwards the rumours spread. The Serpent of Talins had ordered the massacre that day, had urged the Baelish on and screamed for more. The Butcher of Capril, they called her, and she did not deny it. People would far rather believe a lurid lie than a sorry string of accidents, would far rather believe the world is full of evil than full of bad luck, selfishness, and stupidity. Besides, the rumours served a purpose. She was more feared than ever, and fear was useful. In Ospria they denounced her. In Visserine they burned her image. In Afoya and Nicanti they offered a fortune to any man who could kill her. All around the Azure Sea they rang out the bells to her shame. But in Etresani they celebrated. In Talins they lined the streets to chant her name, to shower her with flower petals. In Sessail they raised a statue in her honour, a gaudy thing smothered with gold leaf that soon peeled. She and Benna, as they never looked, seated on great horses, frowning boldly towards a noble future. That was the difference between a hero and a villain, a soldier and a murderer, a victory and a crime. Which side of a river you called home. Return of the Native. Monza was far from comfortable. Her legs ached, her arse was chafed raw from riding, her shoulder had stiffened up again, so she was constantly twisting her head to one side like a demented owl in a futile attempt to loosen it. Whenever one source of sweaty agony would ease for a moment, another would flare up to plug the gap. Her prodding joke of a little finger seemed attached to a cord of cold pain, tightening relentlessly right to her elbow if she tried to use the hand. The sun was merciless in the clear blue sky, making her squint, niggling at the headache leaking from the coins that held her skull together. Sweat tickled her scalp, ran down her neck, gathered in the scars Gobber's wire had left, and made them itch like fury. Her crawling skin was prickly, clammy, sticky. She cooked in her armour like offal in a can. Rogont had her dressed up like some simpleton's notion of the goddess of war, an unhappy collision of shining steel and embroidered silk that offered the comfort of full plate and the protection of a nightgown. It might all have been made to measure by Rogont's own armourer, but there was a lot more room for chest in her gold-chased breastplate than there was a need for. This, according to the Duke of Delay, was what people wanted to see. And enough of them had turned out for the purpose. Crowds lined the narrow streets of Tarlins. They squashed into windows and onto roofs to catch a glimpse of her. They packed into the squares and gardens in dizzying throngs, throwing flowers, waving banners, boiling over with hope. They shouted, bellowed, roared, squealed, clapped, stamped, hooted, competing with each other to be the first to burst her skull with their clamour. Sets of musicians had formed at street corners, would strike up martial tunes as she came close, brassy and blaring, clanging away behind her, merging with the off-key offering of the next impromptu band to form a mindless, murderous, patriotic din. It was like the triumph after her victory at Sweet Pines, only she was older and even more reluctant. Her brother was rotting in the mud instead of basking in the glory, and her old enemy Rogont was at her back rather than her old friend Orso. Perhaps that was what history came down to in the end. Swapping one sharp bastard for another was the best you could hope for. They crossed the Bridge of Tears, the Bridge of Coins, the Bridge of Gulls, looming carvings of seabirds glaring angrily down at the procession as it crawled past, brown waters of the Etris sluggishly churning beneath them. Each time she rounded a corner, another wave of applause would break upon her, another wave of nausea. Her heart was pounding. Every moment she expected to be killed. Blades and arrows seemed more likely than flowers and kind words, and far more deserved. Agents of Duke Orso, or his Union allies, or 100 others with a private grudge against her. Hell, if she'd been in the crowd and seen some woman ride past dressed like this, she'd have killed her on general principle. But Rogont must have spread his rumours well. The people of Tarlins loved her, or loved the idea of her, or had to look like they did. They chanted her name and her brother's name, and the name of her victories. Afieri, Capriel, Musalia, Sweet Pines, the High Bank. The fords of the Sulva, too. She wondered if they knew what they were cheering for. Places she'd left trails of corpses behind her. Cantain's head rotting on the gates of Borletta, her knife in Herman's eye. Gobber hacked to pieces, pulled apart by rats in the sewers beneath their feet. Malthus and his clerks with their poisoned ledgers, poisoned fingers, poisoned tongues. Ario and all his butchered revellers at Cardotti's. Ganmark and his slaughtered guards, faithful, dangling from the wheel. Foscar's head broken open on the dusty floor. Corpses by the cartload. Some of it she didn't regret, some of it she did. But none of it seemed like anything to cheer about. She winced up towards the happy faces at the windows. Maybe that was where she and these folks differed. Maybe they just liked corpses, so long as they weren't theirs. She glanced over her shoulder at her so-called allies, but they hardly gave her comfort. Grand Duke Rogont, the king-in-waiting, smiling to the crowds from a knot of watchful guards, a man whose love would last exactly as long as she was useful. Shivers, steel-eye glinting, a man who'd turned under her tender touch from likeable optimist to maimed murderer. Koska winked back at her, the world's least reliable ally and most unpredictable enemy, and he could still prove to be either one. Friendly. Who knew what went on behind those dead eyes? Further back rode the other surviving leaders of the League of Eight, or Nine. Lerozio of Puranti, fine moustaches bristling, who'd slipped nimbly back into Rogont's camp after the very briefest of alliances with Orso. Countess Cotada, her watchful uncle never far behind. Patine, first citizen of Nicanti, with his emperor's bearing and his ragged peasant's clothes, who had declined to share in the battle at the fords, but seemed more than happy to share in the victory. There were even representatives of cities she'd sacked on Orso's behalf, citizens of Musalia and Etreia, a sly-eyed young niece of Duke Cantaines, who'd suddenly found herself Duchess of Borletta and appeared to be greatly enjoying the experience. People she'd thought of as her enemies for so long she was having trouble making the adjustment, and by the looks on their faces when her eyes met theirs, so were they. She was the spider they had to suffer in their larder to rid them of their flies. And once the flies are dealt with, who wants a spider in their salad? She turned back, sweaty shoulders prickling, tried to fix her eyes ahead. They passed along the endless curve of the seafront, gulls sweeping, circling, calling above. All the way her nose was full of that rotten salt tang of Tarlin's. Past the boatyards, the half-finished hulls of two great warships sitting on the rollers like the skeletons of two beached and rotted whales. Past the rope makers and the sail weavers, the lumber yards and the wood turners, the brass workers and the chain makers. Past the vast and reeking fish market, its flaking stalls empty, its galleries quiet for the first time maybe since the victory at Sweet Pines last emptied the buildings and filled the streets with savagely happy crowds. Behind the multicolored splatters of humanity, the buildings were smothered with bills, as they had been in Tarlin's more or less since the invention of the press. Old victories, warnings, incitements, patriotic bluster, endlessly pasted over by the new. The latest set carried a woman's face, stern, guiltless, coldly beautiful. Monza realized with a sick turning of her guts that it was meant to be hers, and beneath it, boldly printed, strength, courage, glory. Orso had once told her that the way to turn a lie into the truth was to shout it often enough, and here was her self-righteous face, repeated over and over, plastered, torn and dog-eared across the salt-stained walls. On the side of the next crumbling facade, another set of posters, badly drawn and smudgily printed, had her awkwardly holding high a sword beneath the legend, "Never surrender, never relent, never forgive." Daubed across the bricks above them in letters of streaky red paint, tall as a man, was one simple word, vengeance. Monza swallowed, less comfortable than ever. Past the endless docks, where fishing vessels, pleasure vessels, merchant vessels of every shape and size, from every nation beneath the sun, stirred on the waves of the great bay, cobwebs of rigging spotted with sailors up to watch the Snake of Tarlin's take the city for her own, just as Orso had feared she would. Koska was entirely comfortable. It was hot, but there was a soothing breeze wafting off the glittering sea, and one of his ever-expanding legion of new hats was keeping his eyes well shaded. It was dangerous, the crowd very likely containing more than one eager assassin, but for once there were several more hated targets than himself within easy reach. A drink, a drink, a drink, of course. That drunkard's voice in his head would never be entirely silent, but it was less a desperate scream now than a grumpy murmur, and the cheering was very definitely helping to drown it out. Aside from the vague smell of seaweed, it was just as it had been in Austria, after his famous victory at the Battle of the Isles, when he had stood tall in his stirrups at the head of the column, acknowledging the applause, holding his hands up and shouting, "Please, no!" when he meant, "More! More!" It was Grand Duchess Cephaline, Rogon's aunt, who had basked in his reflected glory then, mere days before she tried to have him poisoned. Mere months before the tide of battle turned against her and she was poisoned herself. That was Styrian politics for you. It made him wonder, just briefly, why he was getting into it. The settings change, the people age, the faces swap one with another, but the applause is just the same, vigorous, infectious, and so very short-lived. Ah, grunted Shivers. It seemed to be most of the Northman's conversation now, but that suited Koska well enough. In spite of occasional efforts to change, he had always vastly preferred talking to listening. I always hated Orso, of course, but I find little pleasure in his fall. A towering statue of the fearsome Duke of Tarlins could be seen down a side street as they passed. Orso had ever been a keen patron to sculptors, provided they used him as their subject. Scaffolding had been built up its front, and now men clustered around the face, battering its stern features away gleefully with hammers. So soon, yesterday's heroes are shuffled off, just as I was shuffled off myself. Seems you've shuffled back. My point precisely. We are all washed with the tide. Listen to them cheer for Rogont and his allies, so recently the most despicable slime on the face of the world. He pointed out the fluttering papers pasted to the nearest wall, on which Duke Orso was displayed, having his face pushed into a latrine. Only peel back this latest layer of bills, and I'll wager you'll find others denouncing half this procession in the filthiest ways imaginable. I recall one of Rogont shitting onto a plate, and Duke Salia tucking into the results with a fork. Another of Duke Lirozio trying to mount his horse, and when I say mount, said Shivers. The horse was not impressed. Dig through a few layers more, and, I blush to admit, you'll find some condemning me as the blackest-hearted rogue in the circle of the world. But now... Koska blew an extravagant kiss towards some ladies on a balcony, and they smiled, pointed, showed every sign of regarding him as their delivering hero. The Northman shrugged. People got no weight to 'em down here. Wind blows 'em whatever way it pleases. I have travelled widely, if fleeing one war-torn mess after another qualified, and in my experience people are no heavier elsewhere. He unscrewed the cap from his flask. Men can have all manner of deeply held beliefs about the world in general that they find most inconvenient when called upon to apply to their own lives. Few people let morality get in the way of expediency, or even convenience. A man who truly believes in a thing beyond the point where it costs him is a rare and dangerous thing. It's a special kind of fool takes the hard path just 'cause it's the right one. Koska took a long swallow from his flask, winced and scraped his tongue against his front teeth. It's a special kind of fool who can even tell the right path from the wrong. I've certainly never had that knack. He stood in his stirrups, swept off his hat, and waved it wildly in the air, whooping like a boy of 15. The crowds roared their approval back, just as if he was a man worth cheering for, and not Nikomo Koska at all. So quietly that no one could possibly have heard, so softly that the notes were almost entirely in his mind, Schenkt hummed. Here she is. The pregnant silence gave birth to a storm of applause. People danced, threw up their arms, cheered with hysterical enthusiasm. People laughed and wept, celebrated as if their own lives might be changed to any significant degree by Monscaro Mercato being given a stolen throne. It was a tide Schenkt had often observed in politics. There is a brief spell after a new leader comes to power, however it is achieved, during which they can do no wrong. A golden period in which people are blinded by their own hopes for something better. Nothing lasts forever, of course. In time, and usually with alarming speed, the leader's flawless image grows tarnished with their subjects' own petty disappointments, failures, frustrations. Soon they can do no right. The people clamour for a new leader, that they might consider themselves reborn again. But for now, they cheered Mercato to the heavens, so loud that, even though he had seen it all a dozen times before, Schenkt almost allowed himself to hope. Perhaps this would be a great day, the first of a great era, and he would be proud in after years to have had his part in it, even if his part had been a dark one. Some men, after all, can only play dark parts. The fates, Beside him, Shiloh's lip curled up with scorn. What does she look like? A fucking gold candlestick. A gaudy figurehead, gilded up to hide the rot. I think she looks well. Schenkt was glad to see her still alive, riding a black horse at the head of the sparkling column. Duke Orso might have been all but finished, his people hailing a new leader, his palace at Fontesamo surrounded and under siege. None of that made the slightest difference. Schenkt had his work, and he would see it through to the end, however bitter, just as he always did. Some stories, after all, are only suited to bitter endings. Makato rode closer, eyes fixed ahead in an expression of the most bloody-minded resolve. Schenkt would have liked very much to step forwards, to brush the crowds aside, to smile, to hold out his hand to her. But there were altogether too many onlookers, altogether too many guards. The moment was coming when he would greet her, face to face. For now, he stood as her horse passed by and hummed. So many people. Too many to count. If Friendly tried, it made him feel strange. Vitari's face jumped suddenly from the crowd. Beside her, a gaunt man with short, pale hair and a washed-out smile. Friendly stood in the stirrups, but a waving banner swept across his sight, and they were gone. 1,000 other faces in a blinding tangle. He watched the procession instead. If this had been safety, and Makato and Shivers had been convicts, Friendly would have known without doubt from the look on the Northman's face that he wanted to kill her. But this was not safety, nor was the pity, and there were no rules here that Friendly understood. Especially once women entered the case, for they were a foreign people to him. Perhaps Shivers loved her, and that look of hungry rage was what love looked like. Friendly knew they had been fucking in Visserine. He had heard them at it enough. But then he thought she might have been fucking the Grand Duke of Austria lately, and had no idea what difference that might make. Here was the problem. Friendly had never really understood fucking, let alone love. When he came back to Tarlin's, Sajam had sometimes taken him to whores and told him it was a reward. It seemed rude to turn down a reward, however little he wanted it. To begin with, he had trouble keeping his prick hard. Even later, the most enjoyment he ever got from the messy business was counting the number of thrusts before it was all over. He tried to settle his jangling nerves by counting the hoofbeats of his horse. It seemed best that he avoid embarrassing confusions, keep his worries to himself, and let things take the course they would. If Shivers did kill her, after all, it meant little enough to Friendly. Probably lots of people wanted to kill her. That was what happened when you made yourself conspicuous. Shivers was no monster. He just had enough. Enough of being treated like a fool. Enough of his good intentions fucking him in the arse. Enough of minding his conscience. Enough worrying on other people's worries. And most of all, enough of his face itching. He grimaced as he dug at his scars with his fingernails. Monza was right. Mercy and cowardice were the same. There were no rewards for good behavior. Not in the north, not here, not anywhere. Life was an evil bastard and gave to those who took what they wanted. Right was on the side of the most ruthless, the most treacherous, the most bloody, and the way all these fools cheered for her now was the proof of it. He watched her riding slowly up at the front on her black horse, black hair stirring in the breeze. She'd been right about everything, more or less, and he was going to murder her, pretty much just for fucking someone else. He thought of stabbing her, cutting her, carving her 10 different ways. He thought of the marks on her ribs, of sliding a blade gently between them. He thought of the scars on her neck and how his hands would fit just right against them to throttle her. He guessed it would be good to be close to her one last time. Strange that he should have saved her life so often risked his own to do it, and now be thinking out the best way to put an end on it. It was like the Bloody Nine told him once. Love and hate have just a knife's edge between them. Shivers knew 100 ways to kill a woman that'd all leave her just as dead. It was where and when that were the problems. She was watchful all the time now, expecting knives. Not from him, maybe, but from somewhere. There were plenty of 'em aimed at her besides his, no doubt. Rogant knew it, and was careful with her as a miser with his hoard. He needed her to bring all these people over to his side, always had men watching, so Shivers would have to wait and pick his time. But he could show some patience. It was like Carlot said, nothing done well is ever rushed. Keep closer to her. Aye, none other than the great Duke Rogant, ridden up on his blind side. It took an effort for Shivers not to smash his fist right into the man's sneering, handsome face. Orso still has friends out there. Rogant's eyes jumped nervously over the crowds. Agents, assassins, there are dangers everywhere. Dangers? Everyone seems so happy, though. Are you trying to be funny? Wouldn't know how to begin. Shivers kept his face so slack, Rogant couldn't tell whether he was being mocked or not. Keep closer to her. You're supposed to be a bodyguard. I know what I am. And Shivers gave Rogant his widest grin. Don't worry yourself on that score. He dug his horse's flanks and urged on ahead. Closer to Monza, just like he'd been told. Close enough that he could see her jaw muscles clenched tight on the side of her face. Close enough almost that he could have pulled out his axe and split her skull. I know what I am, he whispered. He was no monster. He'd just had enough. The procession finally came to an end in the heart of the city, the square before the ancient Senate House. The mighty building's roof had collapsed centuries ago, its marble steps cracked and rooted with weeds. The carvings of forgotten gods on the colossal pediment had faded to a tangle of blobs, perches for a legion of chattering gulls. The 10 vast pillars that supported it looked alarmingly out of true, streaked with droppings, stuck with flapping fragments of old bills. But the mighty relic still dwarfed the meaner buildings that had flourished around it, proclaiming the lost majesty of the new empire. A platform of pitted blocks thrust out from the steps and into the sea of people crowding the square. At one corner stood the weathered statue of Scarpius, 4 times the height of a man, holding out hope to the world. His outstretched hand had broken off at the wrist several hundred years ago, and, in what must have been the most blatant piece of imagery in Styria, no one had yet bothered to replace it. Guardsmen stood grimly before the statue on the steps at the pillars. They wore the cross of Tarlins on their coats, but Monza knew well enough they were Rogant's men. Perhaps Styria was meant to be one family now, but soldiers in Osprian blue might not have been well received here. She slid from her saddle, strode down the narrow valley through the crowds. People strained against the guardsmen calling to her, begging for blessings, as though touching her might do them any good. It hadn't done much to anyone else. She kept her eyes ahead, always ahead, jaw aching from being clenched tight, waiting for the blade, the arrow, the dart that would be the end of her. She'd happily have killed for the sweet oblivion of the smoke, but she was trying to cut back on the killing and the smoking both. Scarpius towered over her as she started up the steps, peering down out of the corners of his lichen-crusted eyes, as if to say, is this bitch the best they could do? The monstrous pediment loomed behind him, and she wondered if the 100 tons of rock balanced on those pillars might finally choose that moment to crash down and obliterate the entire leadership of Styria, herself along with them. No small part of her hopes that it would, and bring this sticky ordeal to a swift end. A gaggle of leading citizens, meaning the sharpest and the greediest, had clustered nervously in the center of the platform, sweating in their most expensive clothes, looking hungrily towards her like geese at a bowl of crumbs. They bowed as she and Rogont came closer, heads bobbing together in a way that suggested they'd been rehearsing. That somehow made her more irritated than ever. "Get up!" she growled. Rogont held his hand out. "Where is the circlet?" He snapped his fingers. "The circlet! The circlet!" The foremost of the citizens looked like a bad caricature of wisdom, all hooked nose, snowy beard, and creaky deep voice under a green felt hat like an upended chamber pot.
Madam, my name is Rubin, nominated to speak for the citizens.
"I am Scavia," a plump woman whose azure bodice exposed a terrifying immensity of cleavage. "And I am Grulo," a tall, lean man, bald as an arse, not quite shouldering in front of Scavia, but very nearly.
Our two most senior merchants,
explained Rubin. It carried little weight with Rogont.
And with your permission, Your Excellency, we were hoping to discuss some detail of the arrangements.
"Yes, out with it."
As regards the title, we had hoped perhaps to steer away from nobility. Grand Duchess smacks rather of Orso's tyranny.
"We hoped," ventured Grulo, waving a vulgar finger ring, "something to reflect the mandate of the common people." Rogont winced at Monza, as though the phrase common people tasted of piss. "Mandate? President-elect, perhaps?" offered Scavia. "First citizen?"
After all, added Rubin, the previous Grand Duke is still technically alive.
Rogont ground his teeth. "He is besieged 24 miles away in Fontesarmo like a rat in his hole. Only a matter of time before he is brought to justice."
But you understand the legalities may prove troublesome.
"Legalities?" Rogont spoke in a furious whisper. "I will soon be king of Styria, and I mean to have the Grand Duchess of Talens among those who crown me. I will be king. Do you understand? Legalities are for other men to worry on."
But, Your Excellency, it might not be seen as appropriate.
For a man with a reputation for too much patience, Rogont's had grown very short over the last few weeks. "How appropriate would it be if I was to, say, have you hanged, here, now, along with every other reluctant bastard in the city? You could argue the legalities to each other while you dangle." The threat floated between them for a long, uncomfortable moment. Monza leaned towards Rogont, acutely aware of the vast numbers of eyes fixed upon them. "What we need here is a little unity, no? I've a feeling hangings might send the wrong message. Let's just get this done, shall we? Then we can all lie down in a dark room." Grulo carefully cleared his throat. "Of course." "A long conversation to end where we began," snapped Rogont. "Give me the damn circlet." Scavia produced a thin golden band. Monza turned slowly to face the crowd. "People of Styria!" Rogont roared behind her. "I give you the Grand Duchess Monscaro of Talens!" There was a slight pressure as he lowered the circlet onto her head. And that simply she was raised to the giddy heights of power. With a faint rustling, everyone knelt. The square was left silent, enough that she could hear the birds flapping and squawking on the pediment above, enough that she could hear the spatters as some droppings fell not far to her right, daubing the ancient stones with spots of white, black, and grey. "What are they waiting for?" she muttered to Rogont, doing her best not to move her lips. "Words." "Me? Who else?" A wave of dizzy horror broke over her. By the look of the crowd, she might easily have been outnumbered 5,000 to 1. But she had the feeling that, for her first action as head of state, fleeing the platform in terror might send the wrong message.
So she stepped slowly forwards, as hard a step as she'd ever taken, struggling to get her tumbling thoughts in order, dig up words she didn't have in the splinter of time she did. She passed through Scarpius's great shadow and out into the daylight, and a sea of faces opened up before her, tilted up towards her, wide-eyed with hope. Their scattered muttering dropped to nervous whispering, then to eerie silence. She opened her mouth, still hardly knowing what might come out of it.
"I've never been one—"
Her voice was a reedy squeak. She had to cough to clear it, spat the results over her shoulder, then realized she definitely shouldn't have.
"I've never been one for speeches."
That much was obvious.
"Rather get right to it than talk about it. Born on a farm, I guess. We'll deal with Orso first, rid ourselves of that bastard. Then, well, then the fighting's over."
A strange kind of murmur went through the kneeling crowd. No smiles exactly, but some faraway looks, misty eyes, a few heads nodding. She was surprised by a longing tug in her own chest. She'd never really thought before that she'd wanted the fighting to end. She'd never known much else.
"Peace!"
And that needy murmur rippled across the square again.
"We'll have ourselves a king. All Styria marching one way. An end to the years of blood."
She thought of the wind in the wheat.
"Try to make things grow, maybe. Can't promise you a better world because, well, it is what it is."
She looked down awkwardly at her feet, shifted her weight from one leg to another.
"I can promise to do my best at it, for what that's worth. Let's aim at enough for everyone to get by, and see how we go."
She caught the eye of an old man, staring at her with teary-eyed emotion, lip quivering, hat clasped to his chest.
"That's all," she snapped.
Any normal person would have been lightly dressed on a day so sticky warm, but Makato, with characteristic contrariness, had opted for full and, as it happened, ludicrously flamboyant armour. Morvir's only option, therefore, was to take aim at her exposed face. Still, a smaller target only presented the greater and more satisfying challenge for a marksman of his sublime skills. He took a deep breath. To his horror, she shifted at the crucial moment, looking down at the platform, and the dart missed her face by the barest whisker and glanced from one of the pillars of the ancient Senate house behind her.
"Damn it!"
He hissed around the mouthpiece of his blowpipe, already fumbling in his pocket for another dart, removing its cap, sliding it gently into the chamber. It was a stroke of ill fortune of the variety that had tormented Morvir since birth that, just as he was applying his lips to the pipe, Makato terminated her incompetent rhetoric with a perfunctory, "That's all." The crowd broke into rapturous applause, and his elbow was jogged by the enthusiastic clappings of a peasant beside the deep doorway in which he had secreted himself. The lethal missile went well wide of its target and vanished into the heaving throng beside the platform. The man whose wild gesticulations had been responsible for his wayward aim looked about, his broad, greasy face puckering with suspicion. He had the appearance of a labourer, hands like rocks, the flame of human intellect barely burning behind his piggy eyes.
"Here, what are you—"
Curse the proletariat. Morvir's attempt was now quite foiled.
"My profound regrets, but could I prevail upon you to hold this for just a moment?"
Eh? The man stared down at the blowpipe pressed suddenly into his calloused hands.
"Ah!"
As Morvir jabbed him in the wrist with a mounted needle.
"What the hell?"
"Thank you ever so much."
Morvir reclaimed the pipe and slid it into one of his myriad of concealed pockets, along with the needle. It takes the vast majority of men a great deal of time to become truly incensed, usually following a predictable ritual of escalating threats, insults, posturing, jostling, and so forth. Instantaneous action is entirely foreign to them. So the elbow jogger was only now beginning to look truly angry.
Here!
He seized Morvier by the lapel.
Here!
His eyes took on a faraway look. He wobbled, blinked, his tongue hung out. Morvier took him under the arms, gasped at the sudden dead weight as the man's knees collapsed, and wrestled him to the ground, suffering an unpleasant twinge in his back as he did so.
"You all right?"
someone grunted. Morvier looked up to see a half-dozen not dissimilar men frowning down at him.
"Altogether too much beer,"
Morvier shouted over the noise, adding a false little chuckle.
"My companion here has become quite inebriated."
What?" said one.
"Drunk."
Morvier leaned close.
"He was so very proud to have the great Serpent of Tarlins as the mistress of our fates. Are not we all?"
"Aye," one muttered, utterly confused but partially mollified.
"Course, Makato," he finished lamely,
to grunts of approval from his simian comrades.
"Born among us,"
shouted another, shaking his fist.
"Oh, absolutely so. Makato, freedom, hope, deliverance from coarse stupidity. Here we are, friend."
Morvier grunted with effort as he wriggled the big man, now a big corpse, into the shadows of the doorway. He winced as he arched his aching back. Then, since the others were no longer paying attention, he slid away into the crowds, boiling with resentment all the way. It really was insufferable that these imbeciles should cheer so very enthusiastically for a woman who, far from being born among them, had been born on a patch of scrub on the very edge of Tarlinese territory where the border was notoriously flexible. A ruthless, scheming, lying, apprentice-seducing, mass-murdering, noisily fornicating peasant thief, without a filigree shred of conscience, whose only qualifications for command were a sulky manner, a few victories against incompetent opposition, the aforementioned propensity to swift action, a fall down a mountain, and the accident of a highly attractive face. He was forced to reflect once again, as he had so often, that life was rendered immeasurably easier for the comely. The Lion's Skin. A lot had changed since Monza last rode up to Fontesamo, laughing with her brother. Hard to believe it was only a year ago. The darkest, maddest, most bloody year in a life made of them. A year that had taken her from dead woman to duchess, and might well still shove her back the other way. It was dusk instead of dawn, the sun sinking behind them in the west as they climbed the twisting track. To either side of it, wherever the ground was anything close to flat, men had pitched tents. They sat in front of them in lazy groups by the flickering light of campfires, eating, drinking, mending boots or polishing armor, staring slack-faced at Monza as she clattered past. She'd had no honor guard a year ago. Now a dozen of Rogont's picked men followed eagerly as puppies wherever she went. It was a surprise they didn't all try to tramp into the latrine after her. The last thing the king-in-waiting wanted was for her to get pushed off a mountain again, not before she'd had the chance to help crown him anyway. It was also she'd been helping to his crown 12 months ago, and Rogont her bitter enemy. For a woman who liked to stick, she'd slid around some in 4 seasons. Back then she'd had Benner beside her. Now it was Shivers. That meant no talk at all, let alone laughter. His face was just a hard black outline, blind eye gleaming with the last of the fading light. She knew he couldn't see a thing through it, but still she felt like it was always fixed right on her. Even though he scarcely spoke, still he was always saying, "It should have been you." There were fires burning at the summit, specks of light on the slopes, a yellow glow behind the black shapes of walls and towers, smudges of smoke hanging in the deep evening sky. The road switched back once more, then petered away altogether at a barricade made from 3 upended carts. Victus sat there on a field chair, warming his hands at a campfire, his collection of stolen chains gleaming round his neck. He grinned as she reined up her horse and flourished out an absurd salute. "The Grand Duchess of Tarlin's, here in our slovenly camp. Your Excellency, we're all shame. If we'd had more time to prepare for your royal visit, we'd have done something about all the dirt." And he spread his arms wide at the sea of churned-up mud, bare rock, broken bits of crate and wagons scattered around the mountainside. Victus, the embodiment of the mercenary spirit. She clambered down from her saddle, trying not to let the pain show. Greedy as a duck, brave as a pigeon, loyal as a cuckoo. I always modelled myself on the nobler birds. Afraid you'll have to leave the horses. We'll be going by trench from here. Duke Orso's a most ungracious host. He's taken to shooting catapults at any of his guests who show themselves. He sprang up, slapping dust from the canvas he'd been sitting on, then holding one ring-encrusted hand out towards it. "Perhaps I could have some of the lads carry you up?" "I'll walk." He gave her a mocking leer. "And a fine figure you'll appear, I've no doubt, though I would have thought you could have stretched to silk, given your high station." "Clothes don't make the person, Victus." She gave his jewellery a mocking leer of her own. "A piece of shit is still a piece of shit, however much gold you stick on it." "Oh, how we've missed you, Makato. Follow on, then." "Wait here," she snapped at Rogon's guards. Having them behind her all the time made her look weak, made her look like she needed them. Their sergeant winced. "His Excellency was most—" "Piss on His Excellency. Wait here." She creaked down some steps made of old boxes and into the hillside, shivers at her shoulder. The trenches weren't much different from the ones they'd dug around Muris years ago. Walls of hard-packed earth held back by odds and ends of timber, with that same smell of sickness, mould, damp earth, and boredom. The trenches they'd lived in for the best part of 6 months, like rats in a sewer, where her feet had started to rot, and Benner got the running shits so bad he lost 1/4 of his weight, and all his sense of humour. She even saw a few familiar faces as they threaded their way through ditch, tunnel, and dugout, veterans who'd been fighting with the 1,000 Swords for years. She nodded to them, just as she used to when she was in charge, and they nodded back. "You sure Orso's inside?" she called to Victus. "Oh, we're sure. Koska spoke to him first day." Monza didn't draw much comfort from that idea. When Koska started talking to an enemy, he usually ended up richer and on the other side. "What did those 2 bastards have to say to each other?" "Ask Koska." "I will." "We've got the place surrounded. Don't worry about that. Trenches on 3 sides. Victor slapped the earth beside them. "If you can trust a mercenary to do one thing, it's dig himself a damn good hole to hide in. Then there's pickets down in the woods at the bottom of the cliff." The woods where Monza had slid to a halt in the rubbish, broken to pulp, groaning like the dead in hell. "And a wide selection of Styria's finest soldiery further out. Austrians, Sipponese, Afoyans, in numbers, all set on seeing our old employer dead. There ain't a rat getting out without our say-so. But then, if Orso wanted to run, he could have run weeks ago. He didn't. You know him better than anyone, don't you? You reckon he'll try and run now?" "No," she had to admit. He'd sooner die, which suited her fine. "How about us getting in?" "Whoever designed the bastard place knew what they were doing. Ground around the inner ward's way too steep to try anything." "I could have told you that. North side of the outer ward's your best chance at an assault, then try the inner wall from there." "Our very thoughts, but there's a gulf between thinking and doing, especially when high walls are part of the case. No luck yet. Victus clambered up on a box and beckoned to her. Between two wicker screens, beyond a row of sharpened stakes pointing up the broken slope, she could see the nearest corner of the fortress. One of the towers was on fire, its tall roof fallen in, leaving only a cone of naked beams wreathed in flames, notches of battlements picked out in red and yellow, black smoke belching into the dark blue sky. We set that tower to burning, he pointed proudly towards it, with a catapult. Beautiful. We can all go home. Something, ain't it? He led them through a long dugout smelling of damp and sour sweat, men snoring on pallets down both sides. Wars are won not by one great action, intoning the words like a bad actor, but many small chances. Weren't you always telling us that? Who was it? Stalicus? Stolicus, you dunce. Some dead bastard. Anyway, Koska's got a plan, but I'll let him tell you himself. You know how the old man loves to put on a show. Victor stopped at a hollow in the rock where 4 trenches came together, sheltered by a roof of gently flapping canvas and lit by a single rustling torch. The Captain General said he'd be along. Feel free to make use of the facilities while you wait. Facilities which amounted to dirt. Unless there's anything else, Your Excellency. Just one more thing. He flinched in surprise as her spit spattered softly across his eye. That's from Benner, you treacherous little fuck. Victor swiped his face, eyes creeping shiftily to Shivers, then back to her. I didn't do nothing you wouldn't have done. Nothing your brother wouldn't have done, that's certain. Nothing you didn't both do to Koska, and you owed him more than I owed you. That's why you're wiping your face instead of trying to hold your guts in. You ever think you might have brought this on yourself? Big ambitions mean big risks. All I've done is float with the current. Shivers took a sudden step forwards. Off you float, then, before you get your throat cut. Monza realized he had a knife out in one big fist, the one she'd given him the first day they met. Whoa there, big man! Victus held up his palms, rings glittering. I'm on my way, don't worry. He made a big show of turning and strutting off into the night. You two need to work on your tempers, wagging one finger over his shoulder. No point getting riled up over every little thing. That'll only end in blood, believe me. It wasn't so hard for Monza to believe. Everything ended in blood, whatever she did. She realized she was left alone with Shivers, something she'd spent the last few weeks avoiding like the rot. She knew she should say something, take some sort of step towards making things square with him. They had their problems, but at least he was her man rather than Rogont's. She might have need of someone to save her life in the coming days, and he was no monster, however he might look. Shivers. He turned to her, knife still clutched tight, steel blade and steel eye catching the torch flame and twinkling the colours of fire. Listen. No, you listen. He bared his teeth, taking a step towards her. Monza, you came! Koska emerged from one of the trenches, arms spread wide. And with my favourite Northman. He ignored the knife and shook Shivers warmly by his free hand, then grabbed Monza's shoulders and kissed her on both cheeks. I haven't had a chance to congratulate you on your speech. Born on a farm, a nice touch, humble. And talk of peace? From you? It was like seeing a farmer express his hopes for famine. Even this old cynic couldn't help but be moved. Fuck yourself, old man. But she was secretly glad she didn't have to find the hard words now. Koska raised his brows. You try and say the right thing. Some folk don't like the right thing, said Shivers in his gravelly whisper, sliding his knife away. You ain't learned that yet. Every day alive is a lesson. This way, comrades. Just up ahead, we can get a fine view of the assault. You're attacking, now? We tried in daylight, didn't work. It didn't look like darkness was working any better. There were wounded men lining the next trench, grimaces, groans, bloody bandages. Wherever is my noble employer, His Excellency Duke Rogont? In Tarlin's, and Monza spat into the dirt. There was plenty of it for the purpose. Preparing for his coronation. So soon. He is aware Orso's still alive, I suppose, and by all indications will be for some time yet. Isn't there a saying about selling the lion's skin before he's killed? I've mentioned it many times. I can only imagine. The Serpent of Tarlin's counselling caution to the Duke of Delay. Sweet irony. Some good it's done. He's got every carpenter, clothier and jeweller in the city busy at the Senate House, making it ready for the ceremony. Sure the bloody place won't fall in on him? We can hope, muttered Shivers. It will bring to mind proud shadows of Styria's imperial past, apparently, said Monza. Koska snorted. That, or the shameful collapse of Styria's last effort at unity. I've mentioned that, too, many times. Ignored. Getting used to it. Ah, hubris. As a long-term sufferer myself, I quickly recognized the symptoms. You're like this one, then? Monza couldn't stop herself sneering. He's importing 1,000 white songbirds from distant Thond. Only 1,000? Symbol of peace, apparently. They'll be released over the crowd when he rises to greet them as King of Styria. And admirers from all across the circle of the world, counts, dukes, princes, and the god of the fucking Gurkish too, for all I know, will applaud his gigantic opinion of himself and fall over themselves to lick his fat ass. Koska raised his brows. Do I detect a souring of relations between Tarlin's and Austria? There's something about crowns that makes men act like fools. One takes it you've mentioned that too. Until my throat's sore, but surprisingly enough, he doesn't want to hear it. Sounds quite the event. Shame I won't be there. Monza frowned. You won't? Me? No. I'd only lower the tone. There are concerns about some shady deal done for the dukedom of Visserine, would you believe? Never. Who knows how these far-fetched rumours get started? Besides, someone needs to keep Duke Orso company. She worked her tongue sourly round her mouth and spat again. I hear the two of you have been chatting already. No more than small talk. Weather, wine, women, his impending destruction, you know the sort of thing. He said he would have my head. I replied, I quite understood his enthusiasm, as I find it hugely useful myself. I was firm yet amusing throughout, in fact, while he was, in all honesty, somewhat peevish. Koska waved one long finger around. The siege possibly has him out of sorts. Nothing about you changing sides, then? Perhaps that would have been his next topic, but we were somewhat interrupted by some flatbow fire and an abortive assault upon the walls. Perhaps it will come up when we next take tea together. The trench opened into a dugout, mostly covered with a plank ceiling, almost too low to stand under. Ladders leaned against the right-hand wall, ready for men to climb and join the attack. A good 70 of armed and armoured mercenaries knelt ready to do just that. Koska went bent over between their ranks, slapping backs. Glory, boys! Glory and a decent payoff! Their frowns turned to grins. They tapped their weapons against their shields, their helmets, their breastplates, sending up an approving rattle. General! The Captain General! Koska! Boys! He chuckled, thumping arms, shaking hands, giving out lazy salutes. All as far from her style of command as could have been. She'd had to stay cold, hard, untouchable, or there would have been no respect. A woman can't afford the luxury of being friendly with the men. So she'd let Benner do the laughing for her. Probably why the laughter had been thin on the ground since Orso killed him. And up here is my little home from home. Koska led them up a ladder and into a kind of shed built from heavy logs lit by a pair of flickering lamps. There was a wide opening in one wall, the setting sun casting its last glare over the dark, flat country to the west. Narrow windows faced towards the fortress. A stack of crates took up one corner, the Captain General's chair sat in another. Beside it, a table was covered with a mess of scattered cards, half-eaten sweetmeats, and bottles of varying colour and fullness. "How goes the fight?" Friendly sat cross-legged, dice between his knees.
"It goes."
Monza moved to one of the narrow windows. It was almost night now, and she could barely see any sign of the assault. Perhaps the odd flicker of movement at the tiny battlements, the odd glint of metal in the light of the bonfires scattered across the rocky slopes. But she could hear it. Vague shouting, faint screaming, clattering metal, floating indistinctly on the breeze. Koska slid into the battered Captain General's chair and rattled the bottles by putting his muddy boots up on the table. "We four together again, just like Cardotti's House of Leisure, just like Salia's Gallery. Happy times, eh?" There was the creaking swoosh of a catapult released, and a blazing missile sizzled overhead, shattered against the great foremost tower of the fortress, sending up a gout of flame, shooting out arcs of glittering embers. The dull flare illuminated ladders against the stonework, tiny figures crawling up them, steel glimmering briefly, then fading back into the black. "You sure this is the best time for jokes?" Monza muttered. "Unhappy times are the best for levity. You don't light candles in the middle of the day, do you?" Shivers was frowning up the slope towards Fontesamo. "You really think you've a chance of carrying those walls?" "Those? Are you mad? They're some of the strongest in Syria." "Then why bad form to just sit outside and do nothing? They have ample stocks of food, water, weapons, and, worst of all, loyalty. They might last months in there, months during which Orso's daughter, the Queen of the Union, might prevail upon her reluctant husband to send aid." Monza wondered whether the king learning that his wife preferred women would make any difference. "How's watching your men fall off a wall going to help?" asked Shivers. Koska shrugged. "It will wear down the defenders, deny them rest, keep them guessing, and distract them from any other efforts we might make." "Lot of corpses for a distraction." "Wouldn't be much of a distraction without them." "How'd you get men to climb the ladders for that?" "Sazine's old method." "Eh?" Monza remembered Sazine displaying the money to the new boys, all laid out in sparkling stacks. "If the walls fall, 1,000 scales to the first man on the battlements, 100 each to the next 10 who follow him. Provided they survive to collect the bounty," Koska added. "If the task's impossible, they'll never collect. And if they do, well, you achieved the impossible for 2,000 scales. It ensures a steady flow of willing bodies up the ladders and has the added benefit of weeding the bravest men out of the company to boot." Shivers looked even more baffled. "Why would you want to do that?" "Bravery is the dead man's virtue," Monza muttered. "The wise commander never trusts it." "Mercurio!" Koska slapped one leg. "I do love an author who can make death funny. Brave men have their uses, but they're damned unpredictable, worrying to the herd, dangerous to bystanders." "Not to mention potential rivals for command." "Altogether safest to cream them off." And Koska mimed the action with a careless flick of 2 fingers. "The moderately cowardly make infinitely better soldiers." Shivers shook his head in disgust. "You people got a pretty fucking way of making war." "There is no pretty way of making war, my friend." "You said a distraction," cut in Monza. "I did." "From what?" There was a sudden fizzing sound, and Monza saw fire out of the corner of her eye. A moment later, the heat of it washed across her cheek. She spun, the calves already part-drawn. Ishri was draped across the crates behind them, sprawled out lazily as an old cat in the sun, head back, one long, thin, bandaged leg dangling from the edge of the boxes and swinging gently back and forth. "Can't you ever just say hello?" snapped Monza. "Where would be the fun in that? Do you have to answer every question with another?" Ishri pressed one hand to her bandaged chest, black eyes opening wide. "Who? Me?" She rolled something between her long finger and thumb, a little black grain, and flicked it with uncanny accuracy into the lamp beside Shivers. It went up with a flash and sizzle, cracking the glass hood and spraying sparks. The Northman stumbled away, cursing, flicking embers off his shoulder. "Some of the men have taken to calling it Gurkish sugar." Koska smacked his lips. "Sounds sweeter to my ear than Gurkish fire." 24 barrels, murmured Ishri, courtesy of the Prophet Kalul. Monza frowned. "For a man I've never met, he likes us a lot. Better yet." The dark-skinned woman slithered from the boxes like a snake, waves running through her body from shoulders down to hips as if she had no bones in her, arms trailing after. "He hates your enemies." "No better basis for an alliance than mutual loathing." Koska watched her contortions with an expression stuck between distrust and fascination. "It's a brave new age, my friends. Time was you had to dig for months, hundreds of strides of mine, tons of wood for props, fill it up with straw and oil, set it on fire, run like merry hell, then half the time it wouldn't even bring the walls down. This way, all you need do is sink a shaft deep enough, pack the sugar in, strike a spark, and... boom, sang Ishri, up on her toes and stretching to her fingertips. Kablow, returned Koska. It's how everyone's conducting sieges these days, apparently, and who am I to ignore a trend? He flicked dust from his velvet jacket. Cesaria's a genius at mining. He brought down the bell tower at Ganchetta, you know. Somewhat before schedule, admittedly, and a few men did get caught in the collapse. Did I ever tell you? If you bring the wall down? Asked Monza. Well, then our men pour through the breach, overwhelm the stunned defenders, and the outer ward will be ours. From the gardens within, we'll have level ground to work with and room to bring our numbers to bear. Carrying the inner wall should be a routine matter of ladders, blood, and greed. Then storm the palace and, keep it traditional. I'll get my plunder, and you'll get my revenge. Monza narrowed her eyes at the jagged outline of the fortress. Orso was in there somewhere, only a few hundred strides away. Perhaps it was the night, the fire, the heady mixture of darkness and danger, but some of that old excitement was building in her now, that fierce fury she'd felt when she hobbled from the bone thief's crumbling house and into the rain. How long until the mine's ready? Friendly looked up from his dice.
21 days and 6 hours. At the rate they're going.
A shame. Ishri pushed out her bottom lip. I so love fireworks, but I must go back to the south. Tired of our company already? Asked Monza. My brother was killed. Her black eyes showed no sign of emotion. By a woman seeking vengeance. Monza frowned, not sure if she was being mocked or not. Those bitches find a way of doing damage, don't they? But always to the wrong people. My brother is the lucky one. He is with God. It is the rest of my family that suffer. We must work the harder now. She swung herself smoothly down onto the ladder, let her head fall sideways, uncomfortably far, until it was resting on the top rung. Try not to get yourselves killed. I do not intend that my hard work here be wasted. Your wasted work will be my first concern when they cut my throat. Nothing but silence. Ishri was gone.
Looks like you've run out of brave men,
came Shiver's croak.
Koska sighed. We didn't have many to begin with.
The remnants of the assault were scrambling back down the rocky mountainside in the flickering light of the fires above. Monza could just make out the last ladder toppling down, perhaps a dot or two flailing as they fell from it.
But don't worry, Caesaria's still digging. Just a matter of time until Styria stands united.
He slid a metal flask from his inside pocket and unscrewed the cap.
Or until Orso sees sense and offers me enough to change sides again.
She didn't laugh. Perhaps she wasn't meant to.
Maybe you should try sticking to one side or the other. Why ever would anyone do that?
Koska raised his flask, took a sip, and smacked his lips in satisfaction.
It's a war. There is no right side.
Preparation. Regardless of the nature of a great event, the key to success is always preparation. For 3 weeks, all Tarlins had been preparing for the coronation of Grand Duke Rogont. Meanwhile, Morvier had been preparing for an attempt to murder him and his allies. So much work had been put into both schemes that, now the day for their consummation had finally arrived, Morvier almost regretted that the success of one could only mean the spectacular failure of the other. In all honesty, he had been having little success achieving even the smallest part of Duke Orso's immensely ambitious commission to murder no fewer than 6 heads of state and a captain general. His abortive attempt on the life of Makato the day of her triumphant return to Tarlins, resulting in nothing more than at least 1 poisoned commoner and a sore back, had been but the first of several mishaps. Gaining entrance to one of Tarlin's finest dressmakers through a loose rear window, he had secreted a lethal amaranth thorn within the bodice of an emerald green gown meant for Countess Kutada of Afoya. Alas, Morvier's expertise in dressmaking was most limited. Had Day been there, she would no doubt have pointed out that the garment was twice too large for their waifish victim. The Countess emerged resplendent at a soiree that very evening, her emerald green gown a sensation. Morvier afterwards discovered, much to his chagrin, that the exceedingly large wife of one of Tallinn's leading merchants had also commissioned a green gown from that dressmaker, but was prevented from attending the event by a mysterious illness. She swiftly deteriorated and, alas, expired within hours. 5 nights later, after an uncomfortable afternoon spent hiding inside a heap of coal and breathing through a tube, he had succeeded in loading Duke Lirozzio's oysters with spider venom. Had Day been with him in the kitchen, she might have suggested they aim for a more basic foodstuff, but Morvier could not resist the most noteworthy dish. The Duke, alas, had felt queasy after a heavy lunch and took only a little bread. The shellfish were administered to the kitchen cat, now deceased. The following week, posing once more as the Purentine wine merchant Rotsack Rearvrom, he insinuated himself into a meeting to discuss trade levies chaired by Chancellor Sartorius of Sipani. During the meal, he struck up lively conversation with one of the ancient statesman's aides on the subject of grapes, and was able, much to his delight, deftly to brush the top of Sartorius's withered ear with a solution of leopard flower. He had sat back with great enthusiasm to observe the rest of the meeting, but the Chancellor had steadfastly refused to die, showing, in fact, every sign of being in the most rude health. Morvier could only assume that Sartorius observed a morning routine not dissimilar to his own, and possessed immunities to who knew how many agents. But Castor Morvier was not a man to be put off by a few reverses. He had suffered many in life, and saw no reason to alter his formula of commendable stoicism simply because the task seemed impossible. With the coronation almost upon him, he had therefore chosen to focus on the principal targets: Grand Duke Rogont and his lover, Morvier's hated ex-employer, now the Grand Duchess of Tarlin's Monscaro Mercato. It would have been a rank understatement to say that no expense had been spared to ensure the coronation lived long in Styria's collective memory. The buildings enclosing the square had all been freshly painted. The stone platform where Mercato had administered her fumbling speech and where Rogant planned to soak up the adulation of his subjects as King of Styria had been surfaced with gleaming new marble and adorned with a gilded rail. Workmen crawled on ropes and scaffolds across the looming frontage of the Senate House, garlanding the ancient stonework with fresh-cut white flowers, transforming the sullen edifice into a mighty temple to the Grand Duke of Austria's vanity. Working in dispiriting solitude, Morvier had appropriated the clothes, toolbox, and documentation of a journeyman carpenter who had arrived in the city looking for piecework and hence would be missed by nobody. Yesterday, he had infiltrated the Senate House in this ingenious disguise to reconnoitre the scene and formulate a plan. While doing so, just as a bonus, he had carried out some challenging jointing work to a balustrade with almost conspicuous skill. Truly, he was a loss to carpentry, but he had in no way lost sight of the fact that his primary profession remained murder. Today he had returned to execute his audacious scheme, and to execute Grand Duke Rogant both together.
Afternoon,
he grunted to one of the guards as he passed through the vast doorway along with the rest of the labourers returning from lunch, crunching carelessly at an apple with the surly manner he had often observed in common men on their way to labour. Caution first, always, but when attempting to fool someone, supreme confidence and simplicity was the approach that bore the ripest fruit. He excited, in fact, no attention whatsoever from the guards, either at the gate or at the far end of the vestibule. He stripped the core of his apple and tossed it into his workbox, with only the faintest maudlin moment spent reflecting on how much Day would have enjoyed it. The Senate House was open to the sky, the great dome having collapsed long centuries ago. 3/4 of the tremendous circular space was filled with concentric arcs of seating, enough for 2,000 or more of the world's most honoured spectators. Each marble step was lower than the one behind, so that they formed a kind of theatre, with a space before them where the senators of old had once risen to make their grand addresses. A round platform had been built there now of inlaid wood, painted in meticulous detail with gilded wreaths of oak leaves about a gaudy golden chair. Great banners of vividly coloured Suljuk silk hung down the full height of the walls, some 30 strides or more, at a cost Morvier hardly dared contemplate, one for each of the great cities of Styria. The azure cloth of Austria, marked with the white tower, had pride of place directly behind the central platform. The cross of Tarlin's and the cockle shell of Sipani flanked it upon either side. Arranged evenly about the rest of the circumference were the bridge of Puranti, the red banner of Aphoia, the 3 Bs of Visserine, the 6 rings of Nicanti, and the giant flags of Muris, Etresani, Etrea, Borletta, and Caprile besides. No one, it seemed, was to be excluded from the proud new order, whether they desired membership or not. The whole space crawled with men and women hard at work. Tailors plucked at the hangings, and the miles of white cushions provided for the comfort of the most honoured guests. Carpenters sawed and hammered at the platform and the stairways. Flower sellers scattered the unused floor with a carpet of white blossom. Chandlers carefully positioned their waxen wares in endless rows, teetered on ladders to reach 100 sconces, all overseen by a regiment of Austrian guardsmen, halberds and armour buffed to mirror brightness. For Rogant to choose to be crowned here in the ancient heart of the new empire, the arrogance was incalculable, and if there was one quality Morvier could not abide, it was arrogance. Humility, after all, cost nothing. He concealed his profound disgust and made his way nonchalantly down the steps, affecting the self-satisfied swagger of the working commoner, weaving through the other tradesmen busy among the curving banks of seating. At the back of the great chamber, perhaps 10 strides above the ground, were 2 small balconies, in which, he believed, scribes had once recorded the debates beneath. Now they were adorned by 2 immense portraits of Duke Rogont. One showed him stern and manful, heroically posed with sword and armour. The other depicted His Excellency in pensive mood, attired as a judge, holding book and compass, the master of peace and war. Morvier could not suppress a mocking smirk. Up there, in one of those 2 balconies, would be the fitting spot from which to shoot a dart lethal enough to deflate that idiot's swollen head and puncture his all-vaulting ambitions. They were reached by narrow stairways from a small, unused chamber where records had been kept in ancient... He frowned. Though it stood open, a heavy door, thick oak, intricately bound and studded with polished steel, had been installed across the entrance of the anteroom. He in no way cared for such an alteration at this late stage. Indeed, his first instinct was simply to place caution first and quietly depart, as he had often done before when circumstances appeared to shift. But men did not secure their place in history with caution alone. The venue, the challenge, the potential rewards were too great to let slip on account of a new door. History was breathing upon his neck. For tonight only, his name would be Audacity. He strode past the platform where a dozen decorators were busily applying gilt paint, and to the door. He swung it one way, then the other, lips pursed discerningly as if checking the smooth workings of its hinges. Then, with the swiftest and least conspicuous of glances to ensure he was unobserved, he slipped through. There were neither windows nor lamps within. The only light in the vaulted chamber crept through the door or down the 2 coiling stairways. Empty boxes and barrels were scattered in disorderly heaps about the walls. He was just deciding which balcony to choose as his shooting position when he heard voices approaching the door. He slid quickly on his side into the narrow space behind a stack of crates, squeaked as he picked up a painful splinter in his elbow, remembered his work box just in time, and fished it after him with one foot. A moment later, the door squealed open and scraping boots entered the room, men groaning as though under a dolorous load.
By the fates, it's heavy! Set it here!
A noisy clatter and squeal of metal on stone.
Bastard thing! Where's the key? Here. Leave it in the lock. And what, pray, is the purpose of a lock with the key in it? To present no obstacle, idiot. When we bring the damn case out there in front of 3,000 people and His Excellency tells us to open it up, I don't want to be looking at you and asking where the key is and you find you dropped the fucker somewhere. See what I mean? You have a point. It'll be safer in here, in a barred room with a dozen guards at the door, than in your dodgy pockets. I'm convinced.
There was a gentle rattle of metal.
There. Satisfied?
Several sets of footsteps clattered away. There was the heavy clunk of the door being swung shut, the clicking of locks turned, the squealing of a bar, then silence. Morvier was sealed into a room with a dozen guards outside, but that alone struck no fear into a man of his exceptional fortitude. When the vital moment came, he would lower a cord from one of the balconies and hope to slip away while every eye was focused on Rogont's spectacular demise. With the greatest of care to avoid any further splinters, he wriggled out from behind the crates. A large case had been placed in the centre of the floor, a work of art in itself, fashioned from inlaid wood, bound with bands of filigree silver glimmering in the gloom. Plainly, it contained something of great importance to the coming ceremony, and since chance had provided him the key... He knelt, turned it smoothly in the lock, and with gentle fingers pushed back the lid. It took a great deal to impress a man of Morvier's experience, but now his eyes widened, his jaw dropped, and sweat prickled at his scalp. The yellow sheen of gold almost warmed his skin, yet there was something more in his reaction than appreciation of the beauty, the symbolic significance, or even the undoubted value of the object before him. Something teasing at the back of his mind. Inspiration struck like lightning, making every hair upon his body suddenly stand tall. An idea of such scintillating brilliance, yet such penetrating simplicity, that he found himself almost in fear of it. The magnificent daring, the wonderful economy, the perfectly fitting irony. He only wished Day had lived to appreciate his genius. Morvier triggered the hidden catch in his workman's box and removed the tray carrying the carpenter's equipment, revealing the carefully folded silken shirt and embroidered jacket in which he would make his escape. His true tools lay beneath. He carefully pulled on the gloves, ladies' gloves of the finest calfskin, for they offered the least resistance to the dexterous operation of his fingers, and reached for the brown glass jar. He reached for it with some trepidation, for it contained a contact venom of his own devising, which he called Preparation Number 12. There would be no repetition of his error with Chancellor Sartorius, for this was a poison so deadly that not even Morvier himself could develop the slightest immunity to it. He carefully unscrewed the cap, caution first always, and taking up an artist's brush, began to work. Rules of War. Koska crept down the tunnel, knees and back aching fiercely from bending almost double, snatched breath echoing on the stale air. He had become far too accustomed to no greater exertions than sitting around and working his jaw over the last few weeks. He swore a silent oath to take exercise every morning, knowing full well he would never keep it, even until tomorrow. Still, it was better to swear an oath and never follow through than not even to bother with the oath, wasn't it? His trailing sword scratched soil from the dirt walls with every step. Should have left the bloody thing behind. He peered down nervously at the glittering trail of black powder that snaked off into the shadows, holding his flickering lamp as far away as possible, for all it was made of thick glass and weighty cast iron. Naked flames and gurkish sugar made unhappy companions in a confined space. He saw flickering light ahead, heard the sounds of someone else's laboured breath, and the narrow passageway opened out into a chamber lit by a pair of guttering lamps. It was no bigger than a good-sized bedroom, walls and ceiling of scarred rock and hard-packed earth held up by a web of suspect-looking timbers. More than half the room, or the cave, was taken up by large barrels. A single gurkish word was painted on the side of each one. Koska's cantic did not extend far beyond ordering a drink, but he recognized the characters for fire. Cesaria was a great dark shape in the gloom, long ropes of grey hair hanging about his face, beads of sweat glistening on his black skin as he strained at a keg. "It's time," said Koska, his voice falling flat in the dead air under the mountain. He straightened up with great relief, was hit with a dizzy rush of blood to the head, and stumbled sideways.
"What?" screeched Cesaria. "What you doing with that lamp, Koska? A spark in the wrong place and the pair of us will be blown to heaven."
Don't let that worry you. He regained control of his feet. I'm not a religious man, but I very much doubt anyone will be letting either of us near heaven.
"Blown to hell, then."
A much stronger possibility. Cesaria grunted as he ever so gingerly shifted the last of the barrels up tight to the rest.
"All the others out?"
They should be back in the trenches by now. The big man wiped his hands on his grimy shirt.
"And we're ready, General."
Excellent. These last few days have positively crawled. It's a crime, when you think about how little time we get, that a man should ever be bored. When you're lying on your deathbed, I expect you regret those weeks wasted more than your worst mistakes.
"You should have said if you had nothing pressing. We could have used your help digging.
At my age, the only place I'll be moving soil is on the latrine, and even that's a lot more work than it used to be. What happens now?
I hear it only gets harder.
Very good. I meant with the mine. Cesaria pointed to the trail of black powder, grains gleaming in the lamplight, stopping well short of the nearest keg.
That leads to the entrance to the mine.
He patted a bag at his belt.
We join it up to the barrels, leave plenty of extra at the end to make sure it takes. We get to the mouth of the tunnel, we set a spark to one end, then
the fire follows it all the way to the barrels, and how big will the explosion be? Cesaria shook his head.
Never seen a quarter as much powder used at one time. That, and they keep mixing it stronger. This new stuff, I have a worry it might be too big.
Better a grand gesture than a disappointing one.
Unless it brings the whole mountain down on us.
It could do that.
Who knows what it'll do?
Koska considered the thousands of tons of rock above their heads without enthusiasm. It's a little late for second thoughts. Victus has his picked men ready for the assault. Rogont will be king tonight, and he's expecting to honour us with his majestic presence at dawn, and very much inside the fortress so he can order the final attack. I'm damned if I'm going to spend my morning listening to that fool whine at me, especially with a crown on.
You think he'll wear it, day to day?
Koska scratched thoughtfully at his neck. Do you know, I've no idea. But it's somewhat beside the point.
True.
Cesaria frowned at the barrels.
Doesn't seem right somehow. You dig a hole, you touch a torch to some dust, you run and...
Pop,
said Koska. No need for thinking, no need for courage. No way to fight if you're asking me.
The only good way to fight is the one that kills your enemy and leaves you with the breath to laugh. If science can simplify the process, well, so much the better. Everything else is flim-flam. Let's get started.
I hear my Captain General and obey.
Cesaria pulled the bag from his belt, bent down, and started carefully tipping powder out, joining the trail up to the barrels.
Got to think about how you'd feel, though, haven't you?
Have you?
One moment you're going about your business, the next you're blasted to bits. Never get to even look your killer in his face.
No different from giving others the orders. Is killing a man with powder any worse than getting someone else to stab him with a spear? When exactly did you last look a man in the face? Not when he'd happily helped stab Koska in the back at Affieri, that was sure. Cesaria sighed, powder trickling out across the ground.
True, maybe. But sometimes I miss the old days, you know. Back when Cezine was in charge. Seemed like a different world then, a more honest world.
Koska snorted. You know as well as I do there wasn't a dirty trick this side of hell Cezine would have balked at using. That old miser would have blown the world up if he thought a penny would fall out.
Yes, you've the truth of it. Doesn't seem fair, though.
I never realized you were such an enthusiast for fair.
It's no deal-breaker, but I'd rather win a fair fight than an unfair one.
He upended the bag, the last powder sliding out and leaving a glittering heap right against the side of the nearest barrel.
Leaves a better taste, somehow, fighting by some kind of rules.
Koska clubbed him across the back of the head with his lamp, sending up a shower of sparks and knocking Cesaria sprawling on his face. This is war. There are no rules. The big man groaned, shifted, struggled weakly to push himself up. Koska leaned down, raised the lamp high, and bashed him on the skull again, with a crunching of breaking glass, knocked him flat, embers sizzling in his hair. A little closer to the powder than was comfortable, perhaps, but Koska had always loved to gamble. He had always loved triumphant rhetoric, too, but time was a factor. So he turned for the shadowy passageway and hurried down it. A dozen cramped strides, and he was already breathing hard again. A dozen more, and he thought he caught the faintest glimmer of daylight up the tunnel. He knelt down, chewing at his lip. He was far from sure how fast the trail would burn once it was lit.
Good thing I always loved to gamble.
He carefully began to unscrew the broken cage around the lamp. It was stuck. Shit! He strained at it, fingers slipping, but it must have got bent when he clubbed Cesaria. Bastard thing! He shifted his grip, growled as he twisted with all his force. The top popped off suddenly. He fumbled both halves, the lamp dropped, he tried to catch it, missed, it hit the floor, bounced, guttered and went out, sinking the passageway into inky darkness. Fucking shit! His only option was to retrace his steps and get one of the lamps from the end of the tunnel. He took a few steps, one hand stretched out in front of him, fishing in the black. A beam caught him right in the face, snapped his head back, mouth buzzing, salty with blood. Gah! He saw light, shook his throbbing head, strained into the darkness. Lamplight catching the grain of the props, the stones and roots in the walls, making the snaking trail of powder glisten. Lamplight. And unless he had completely lost his bearings, it was coming from where he had left Cesaria. Bringing his sword seemed suddenly to have been a stroke of genius. He slid it gently from its sheath with a reassuring ring of metal, had to work his elbow this way and that in the narrow space to get it pointing forwards, accidentally stuck the ceiling with the point and caused a long rivulet of soil to pour gently down onto his bald patch. All the while the light crept closer. Cesaria appeared around the bend, lamp in one big fist, a line of blood creeping down his forehead. They faced one another for a moment, Koska crouching, Cesaria bent double. "Why?" grunted the big man. "Because I make a point of never letting a man betray me twice."
I thought you were all business.
Men change.
You killed Andish.
Best moment of the last 10 years. Cesaria shook his head, as much puzzled as angry and in pain.
Makato was the one took your chair, not us.
Entirely different matter. Women can betray me as often as they please.
You always did have a blind spot for that mad bitch.
I'm an incurable romantic. Or maybe I just never liked you. Cesaria slid a heavy knife out in his free hand.
You should have stabbed me back there.
I'm glad I didn't. Now I get to use another clever line.
Don't suppose you'd consider putting that sword away and fighting knife to knife?
Koska gave a cackle. You're the one who likes things fair. I tried to kill you by clubbing you from behind, then blowing you up, remember? Stabbing you with a sword will give me no sleepless nights. And he lunged. In such a confined space, being a big man was a profound disadvantage. Cesaria almost entirely filled the narrow tunnel, which made him, fortunately, more or less impossible to miss. He managed to steer the clumsy jab away with his knife, but it still pricked him in the shoulder. Koska pulled back for another thrust, squawked as he caught his knuckles on the earth wall. Cesaria swung his heavy lamp at him, and Koska flopped away, slipped, and went over on one knee. The big man scrambled forwards, raising the knife. His fist scraped on the ceiling, bringing down a shower of earth. His knife thudded deep into a beam above. He mouthed some curse in Cantic, wincing as he struggled to drag the blade free. Koska righted himself and made another clumsy lunge. Cesaria's eyes bulged as the point punctured his shirt and slid smoothly through his chest. "There!" Koska snarled in his face. "Do you get my point?" Cesaria lurched forwards, groaning bloody drool, face locked in a desperate grimace, the blade sliding inexorably through him until the hilt got tangled with his sticky shirt. He seized hold of Koska and toppled over, bearing him down on his back, the pommel of the sword digging savagely into his stomach and driving all his breath out in a creaking "Ooh!" Cesaria curled back his lips to show red teeth.
You call that a clever line?
He smashed his lamp down into the trail of powder beside Koska's face. Glass shattered, flame leapt up. There was a fizzling pop as the powder caught, the heat of it near to burning Koska's cheek. He struggled with Cesaria's great limp body, struggled to untwist his fingers from the gilded basketwork of his sword, desperately tried to wrestle the big corpse sideways. His nose was full of the acrid reek of gurkish sugar, snapping sparks moving off slowly down the passage. He finally dragged himself free, clambered up, and ran for the entrance, breath wheezing in his chest, one hand trailing along the dirt wall, knocking against the props. An oval of daylight appeared, wobbled steadily closer. He gave vent to a foolish giggle as he wondered whether it would be this moment or the next that saw the rock he was tottering through a mile in the sky. He burst out into open air. "Run!" he screeched at no one, flinging his hands wildly around. "Run!" He pounded down the hillside, tripped, fell, rolled head over heels, bounced painfully from a rock, struggled up, and carried on scrambling in a cloud of dust, loose stones clattering around him. The wicker shields that marked the nearest trench crept closer, and he charged towards them, screaming madly at the top of his voice. He flung himself onto his face, slid along in the dirt, crashed between two screens, and headlong down into the trench in a shower of loose soil. Victor stared at him as he struggled to right himself. "What the—" "Take cover!" wailed Koska. All around him, armour rattled as men shrank down into their trenches, raised their shields over their heads, clapped their gauntleted hands over their ears, squeezed their eyes tight shut in anticipation of an explosion to end the world. Koska jammed himself back against the hard-packed earth, teeth squeezed together, clasping his hands around his skull. The silent moment stretched out. Koska prized one eye open. A bright blue butterfly fluttered heedlessly down, circled widdershins around the cowering mercenaries, and came peacefully to rest on the blade of a spear. Victus himself had his helmet pushed right down over his face. Now he slowly tipped it back to display an expression of some confusion. "What the hell happened? Is the fuse lit? Where's Cesaria?" A sudden image formed in Koska's mind of the trail of powder sputtering out, of Victus's men creeping into the murky darkness, lamps raised, their light falling across Cesaria's corpse, impaled on a sword with unmistakable gilded basketwork. The very faintest of tremors touched the earth at Koska's back. A moment later, there was a thunderous detonation, so loud that it sent pain lancing through his head. The world went suddenly entirely silent, but for a faint, high-pitched whine. The earth shook, wind ripped and eddied along the trench, tearing at his hair and nearly dragging him over. A cloud of choking dust filled the air, nipping at his lungs and making him cough. Gravel rained down from the sky. He gasped as he felt it sting at his arms, at his scalp. He cowered like a man caught out in a hurricane, every muscle tensed. For how long, he was not sure. Koska opened his eyes, dumbly uncurled his aching limbs, and got weakly to his feet. The world was a ghost place of silent fog. The land of the dead, surely. Men and equipment no more than phantoms in the murk. The mist began to clear. He rubbed at his ears, but the whining continued. Others got up, staring around, faces caked with grey dirt. Not far away, someone lay still in a puddle in the bottom of a trench, his helmet stoved in by a chunk of rock, steered by the fickle fates directly onto his head. Koska peered over the lip of the trench, blinked up towards the summit of the mountain, straining through the gradually settling dust. Oh! The wall of Fontesamo appeared undamaged, the outline of towers and battlements still very much present against the lead-white sky. A vast crater had been blown from the rock, but the great round tower directly above it still clung stubbornly to the edge, even slightly overhanging empty space. It seemed for a moment to be perhaps the most crushing anticlimax of Koska's life, and there had been many. Then, in dreamlike silence and with syrupy slowness, that central tower leaned, buckled, fell in on itself, and collapsed into the yawning crater. A huge section of wall to either side of it was dragged after, all folding up and dissolving into rubble under its own weight. A man-made landslide of hundreds of tons of stone rolled, bounced, crashed down towards the trenches. "Ah," said Koska silently. For a second time, men flung themselves on their faces, covered their heads, prayed to the fates, or whichever of a range of gods and spirits they did or did not believe in, for deliverance. Koska stayed standing, staring fascinated as a giant chunk of masonry, perhaps 10 tons in weight, hurtled down the slope directly towards him, bouncing, spinning, flinging pieces of stone high into the air, all without the slightest sound, but for perhaps a vague crunching, like footsteps on gravel. It came to an eventual stop no more than 10 strides distant, rocked gently to one side and the other, and was still. A second cloud of dust had plunged the trench into choking gloom, but as it gradually faded, Koska could see the vast breach left in the outer wall of Fontesamo, no fewer than 200 strides across, the crater beneath it now choked with settling rubble. A second tower at its edge leaned at an alarming angle, like a drunken man peering over a cliff, ready at any moment to topple into emptiness. He saw Victor stand beside him, raise his sword, and scream. The word didn't sound much louder than if he had spoken it. "Charge!" Men clambered, somewhat dazed, from the trenches. One took a couple of wobbling steps and fell on his face. Others stood there, blinking. Still others began to head uncertainly uphill. More followed, and soon there were a few hundred men scrambling through the rubble towards the breach, weapons and armour shining dully in the watery sun. Koska was left alone in the trench with Victus, both of them coated with grey dust. "Where's Cesaria?" The words thudding dully through the whine in Koska's ears. His own voice was a weird burble. "He wasn't behind me?" "No! What happened?" "An accident as we came out." It wasn't difficult to force out a tear. Koska was covered head to toe in knocks and bruises. "I dropped my lamp, dropped it, set off the trail of powder halfway down." He seized Victus by his fluted breastplate. "I told him to run with me, but he stayed to put it out." "He stayed?" "He thought he could save us both." Koska put one hand over his face, voice choked with emotion. "My fault! All my fault! He truly was the best of us." He wailed it at the sky. Why? Why do the fates always take the best?" Victus's eyes flickered down to Koska's empty scabbard, then back up to the great crater in the hillside, the yawning breach above it. "Dead, eh?" "Blown to hell," whispered Koska. "Baking with Gurkish sugar can be a dangerous business." The sun had come out. Above them, Victus's men were clambering up the sides of the crater and into the breach in a twinkling tide, apparently entirely unopposed. If any defenders had survived the blast, they were in no mood to fight. It seemed the outer ward of Fontesamo was theirs. "Victory! At least Cesaria's sacrifice was not in vain." "Oh, no." Victus looked sideways at him through narrowed eyes. "He'd have been proud." One nation. The echoing grumble of the crowd on the other side of the doors grew steadily louder, and the churning in Monza's guts grew with it. She tried to rub away the niggling tension under her jaw. It did no good. But there was nothing to do except wait. Her entire role in tonight's grand performance was to stand there with a straight face and look like the highest of nobility, and Tarlin's best dressmakers had done all the hard work in making that ludicrous lie seem convincing. They'd given her long sleeves to cover the scars on her arms, a high collar to cover the scars on her neck, gloves to render her ruined hand presentable. They'd been greatly relieved they could keep her neckline low without horrifying Rogont's delicate guests. It was a wonder they hadn't cut a great hole out of the back to show her arse. It was about the only other patch of her skin without a mark across it. Nothing could be seen that might spoil the perfection of Duke Rogont's moment of history. No sword, certainly, and she missed the weight of it like a missing limb. She wondered when was the last time she'd stepped out without a blade in easy reach. Not in the meeting of the Council of Tarlins she'd attended the day after being lifted to her new station. Old Rubine had suggested she had no need to wear a sword in the chamber. She replied she'd worn one every day for 20 years. He'd politely pointed out that neither he nor his colleagues carried arms, though they were all men and hence better suited. She asked him what she'd use to stab him with if she left her sword behind. No one was sure whether she was joking or not, but they didn't ask again.
Your Excellency.
One of the attendants had oozed over and now offered her a silky bow.
Your Grace.
And another to Countess Cotada.
We're about to begin.
Good, snapped Monza. She faced the double doors, shifted her shoulders back and her chin up.
Let's get this fucking pantomime over with.
She had no time to spare. Every waking moment of the last 3 weeks, and she'd scarcely slept since Rogont jammed the circlet on her head, she'd spent struggling to drag the state of Tarlins out of the cesspit she'd fought so hard to shove it into. Keeping in mind Bialaveld's maxim, any successful state is supported by pillars of steel and gold, she'd dug out every cringing bureaucrat she could find, who wasn't besieged in Fontesamo along with their old master. There'd been discussions about the Tarlinese army. There wasn't one. Discussions about the treasury. It was empty. The system of taxation, the maintenance of public works, the preservation of security, the administration of justice, all dissolved like cake in a stream. Rogont's presence, or that of his soldiers anyway, was all that was keeping Tarlins from anarchy. But Monza had never been put off by a wind in the wrong direction. She'd always had a knack for reckoning a man's qualities and picking the right one for a given job. Old Rubine was pompous as a prophet, so she made him High Magistrate. Grullo and Scavia were the two most ruthless merchants in the city. She didn't trust either, so she made them joint chancellors and set each one to dream up new taxes, compete in their collection while keeping one jealous eye on the other. Already they were wringing money from their unhappy colleagues, and already Monza had spent it on arms. 3 long days into her unpromising rule, an old sergeant called Volfier had arrived in the city, a man almost laughably hard-bitten and nearly as scarred as she was. Refusing to surrender, he'd led the 23 survivors of his regiment back from the rout at Ospria and all the way across Styria with arms and honour intact. She could always use a man that bloody-minded and set him to rounding up every veteran in the city. Paying work was thin on the ground, and he already had 2 companies of volunteers, their glorious charge to escort the tax collectors and make sure not a copper went missing. She'd marked Duke Orso's lessons well. Gold to steel to more gold. Such was the righteous spiral of politics. Resistance, apathy, and scorn from all quarters only made her shove harder. She took a perverse satisfaction in the apparent impossibility of the task. The work pushed the pain to one side, and the husk with it, and kept her sharp. It had been a long, long time since she'd made anything grow.
You look very beautiful.
What? Cotada had glided up silently beside her and was offering a nervous smile.
Oh, Likewise,
grunted Monza, barely even looking.
White suits you. They tell me I'm too pale for white.
Monza winced, just the kind of mindless twittering she had no stomach for tonight.
I wish I was like you. Some time in the sun would do it. No, brave.
Cortada looked down at her pale fingers, twisting them together.
I wish I was brave. They tell me I'm powerful. One would have thought being powerful would mean one need not be scared of anything. But I'm afraid all the time, especially at events.
The words spilled out of her to Monza's mounting discomfort.
Sometimes I can't move for the weight of it, all the fear. I'm such a disappointment. What can I do about that? What would you do?
Monza had no intention of discussing her own fears. That would only feed them. But Cortada blathered on regardless.
I've no character at all. But where does one get character from? Either you have it or you don't. You have. Everyone says you have. Where did you get it? Why don't I have any? Sometimes I think I'm cut out of paper, just acting like a person. They tell me I'm an utter coward. What can I do about that, being an utter coward?
They stared at each other for a long moment. Then Monza shrugged.
Act like you're not.
The doors were pulled open. Musicians, somewhere out of sight, struck up a stately refrain as she and Cortada stepped out into the vast bowl of the Senate House. Though there was no roof, though the stars would soon show in the blue-black sky above, it was hot and clammy as a tomb, and the perfumed stink of flowers caught at Monza's tight throat and made her want to retch. Thousands of candles burned in the darkness, filling the great arena with creeping shadows, making gilt glimmer, gems glitter, turning the hundreds upon hundreds of smiling faces that soared up on all sides into leering masks. Everything was outsize. The crowd, the rustling banners behind them, the venue itself. Everything was overdone, like a scene from a lurid fantasy. A hell of a lot of effort just to watch one man put on a new hat. The audience were a varied lot. Styrians made up the bulk, rich and powerful men and women, merchants and minor nobility from across the land. A smattering of famous artists, diplomats, poets, craftsmen, soldiers. Rogant wanted no one excluded who might reflect some extra glory onto him. Guests from abroad occupied most of the better seats, down near the front, come to pay their respects to the new king of Styria, or to try to wangle some advantage from his elevation at least. There were merchant captains of the 1,000 Isles with golden hoops through their ears. There were heavy-bearded Northmen, bright-eyed Baelish. There were natives of Soljuk in vivid silks, a pair of priestesses from Thond, where they worshipped the sun, heads shaved to yellow stubble. There were 3 nervous-seeming aldermen of Westport. The Union, unsurprisingly, was notable by its utter absence, but the Gurkish delegation had willingly spread out to fill their space. A dozen ambassadors from the Emperor Uthman ul-Dosht, heavy with gold. A dozen priests from the prophet Khalul in sober white. Monza walked through them all as if they weren't there, shoulders back, eyes fixed ahead, the cold sneer on her mouth she'd always worn when she was most terrified. Lerozio and Patine approached with equal pomposity down a walkway opposite. Sartorius waited by the chair that was the golden centerpiece of the entire event, leaning heavily on a staff. The old man had sworn he'd be consigned to hell before he walked down a ramp. They reached the circular platform, gathering under the expectant gaze of several thousand pairs of eyes. The 5 great leaders of Styria, who'd enjoy the honor of crowning Rogant, all dressed with a symbolism that a mushroom couldn't have missed. Monza was in pearly white, with the cross of Talins across her chest in sparkling fragments of black crystal. Cortada wore a Foyan scarlet. Sartorius had golden cockle shells around the hem of his black gown, Lerozio the bridge of Purante on his gilded cape. They were like bad actors representing the cities of Styria in some cheap morality play, except at vast expense. Even Patine had shed any pretense at humility and swapped his rough-spun peasant cloth for green silk, fur, and sparkling jewels. 6 rings were the symbol of Nicanti, but he must have been sporting 9 at least, one with an emerald the size of Friendly's dice. At close quarters, none of them looked particularly pleased with their role. Like a group who'd agreed while blind drunk to jump into the freezing sea in the morning, but now, with the sober dawn, were thinking better of it. "Well," grunted Monza, as the musicians brought their piece to an end and the last notes faded, "here we are."
"Indeed."
Sartorius swept the murmuring crowd with rheumy eyes.
"Let us hope the crown is large. Here comes the biggest head in Styria."
An ear-splitting fanfare blasted out from behind. Cotada flinched, stumbled, would have fallen if Monza hadn't seized her elbow on an instinct. The doors at the very back of the hall were opened, and as the blaring sound of trumpets faded, a strange singing began, a pair of voices, high and pure, floating out over the audience. Rogont stepped smiling through into the Senate House, and his guests broke out into well-organized applause. The king-in-waiting, all in Austrian blue, looked about him with humble surprise as he began to descend the steps. All this for me? You shouldn't have. And of course he'd planned every detail himself. Monza wondered for a moment, and not for the first time, whether Rogont would turn out to be a far worse king than Orso might have been. No less ruthless, no more loyal, but a lot more vain and less sense of humor every day. He pressed favored hands in his, laying a generous palm on a lucky shoulder or two as he passed. The unearthly singing serenaded him as he came through the crowd.
"Can I hear spirits?"
muttered Patine with withering scorn.
"You can hear boys with no balls," replied Lerozio.
4 men in Austrian livery unlocked a heavy door behind the platform and passed inside, came out shortly afterwards, struggling under the weight of an inlaid case. Rogont made a swift pass around the front row, pressing the hands of a few chosen ambassadors, paying particular attention to the Gurkish delegation, and stretching the applause to breaking point. Finally, he mounted the steps to the platform, smiling, the way the winner of a vital hand of cards smiles at his ruined opponents. He held his arms out to the 5 of them. My friends, the day is finally here."
"It is,"
said Sartorius simply.
"Happy day,"
sang Lerozio.
"long hoped for,"
added Patine.
"Well done,"
offered Cotada. "My thanks to you all." Rogont turned to face his guests, silenced their clapping with a gentle motion of his hands, swept his cloak out behind him, lowered himself into his chair, and beckoned Monza over. "No congratulations from you, Your Excellency?"
"Congratulations,"
she hissed. "As graceful as always." He leaned closer, murmuring under his breath, "You did not come to me last night."
"Other commitments."
"Truly?" Rogont raised his brows as though amazed that anything could possibly be more important than fucking him. "I suppose a head of state has many demands upon her time. Well," he waved her scornfully away. Monza ground her teeth. At that moment, she would have been more than willing to piss on him. The 4 porters set down their burden behind the throne. One of them turned the key in the lock and lifted the lid with a showy flourish. A sigh went up from the crowd. The crown lay on purple velvet inside. A thick band of gold, set all around with a row of darkly gleaming sapphires. 5 golden oak leaves sprouted from it, and at the front, a larger sixth curled about a monstrous, flashing diamond, big as a chicken's egg. So large, Monza felt a strange desire to laugh at it. With the expression of a man about to clear a blocked latrine with his hand, Lerozio reached into the case and grasped one of the golden leaves. A resigned shrug of the shoulders, and Patine did the same. Then Sartorius and Cotada. Monza took hold of the last in her gloved right fist, poking little finger, looking no better for being sheathed in white silk. She glanced across the faces of her supposed peers. 2 forced smiles, a slight sneer, and an outright scowl. She wondered how long it would take for these proud princes, so used to being their own masters, to tire of this less favourable arrangement. By the look of things, the yoke was already starting to chafe. Together, the 5 of them lifted the crown and took a few lurching steps forwards, Sartorius having to awkwardly negotiate the case, dragging each other clumsily about by the priceless symbol of majesty. They made it to the chair, and between them raised the crown high over Rogont's head. They paused there for a moment, as if by mutual agreement, perhaps wondering if there was still some way out of this. The whole great space was eerily silent, every man and woman holding their breath. Then Sartorius gave a resigned nod, and together the 5 of them lowered the crown, seated it carefully on Rogont's skull, and stepped away. Styria, it seemed, was one nation. Its king rose slowly from the chair and spread his arms wide, palms open, staring straight ahead as though he could see right through the ancient walls of the Senate House and into a brilliant future. "Our fellow Styrians!" he bellowed, voice ringing from the stones. "Our humble subjects, and our friends from abroad, all welcome here." Mostly Gurkish friends, but since the prophet had stretched to such a large diamond for his crown. "The years of blood are at an end," or they soon would be, once Monza had spilled Orso's. "No longer will the great cities of our proud land struggle one against the other." That remained to be seen. "But will stand as brothers eternal, bound willingly by happy ties of friendship, of culture, of common heritage, marching together," in whatever direction Rogont dictated, presumably. "It is as if Styria wakes from a nightmare 19 years long. Some among us, I am sure, can scarcely remember a time without war." Monza frowned, thinking of her father's plough turning the black earth. "But now the wars are over, and all of us won, every one of us." Some won more than others, it needed hardly be said. "Now is the time for peace, for freedom, for healing." Lerozio noisily cleared his throat, wincing as he tugged at his embroidered collar. "Now is the time for hope, for forgiveness, for unity." And abject obedience, of course. Cotada was staring at her hand. Her pale palm was mottled pink, almost deep enough to match her scarlet dress. "Now is the time for us to forge a great state that will be the envy of the world. Now is the time—" Lerozio had started to cough, beads of sweat showing on his ruddy face. Rogont frowned furiously sideways at him. "Now is the time for Styria to become—" Patine bent forwards and gave an anguished groan, lips curled back from his teeth. "One nation!" Something was wrong, and everyone was beginning to see it. Cotada lurched backwards, stumbled. She caught the gilded railing, chest heaving, and sank to the floor with a rustling of red silk. The audience gave a stunned collective gasp. "One nation," whispered Rogont. Chancellor Sartorius sank trembling to his knees, one pink-stained hand clutching at his withered throat. Patine was crouched on all fours now, face bright red, veins bulging from his neck. Lerozio toppled onto his side, back to Monza, his breath a faint wheeze. His right arm stretched out behind him, the twitching hand blotched pink. Cotada's leg kicked faintly, then she was still. All the while, the crowd stayed silent, transfixed, not sure if this was some demented part of the show, some awful joke. Patine sagged onto his face. Sartorius fell backwards, spine arched, heels of his shoes squeaking against the polished wood, then flopped down limp. Rogant stared at Monza, and she stared back, as frozen and helpless as she had been when she watched Benna die. He opened his mouth, raised one hand towards her, but no breath moved. His forehead, beneath the fur-trimmed rim of the crown, had turned angry red. The crown. They had all touched the crown. Her eyes rolled down to her gloved right hand. All except her. Rogant's face twisted. He took one step, his ankle buckled, and he pitched onto his face, bulging eyes staring sightlessly off to the side. The crown popped from his skull, bounced once, rolled across the inlaid platform to its edge, and clattered to the floor below. Someone in the audience gave a single ear-splitting scream. There was the whoosh of a counterweight falling, a rattle of wood, and 1,000 white songbirds were released from cages concealed around the edges of the chamber, rising up into the clear night air in a beautiful, twittering storm. It was just as Rogant had planned, except that of the 6 men and women destined to unite Styria to bring an end to the years of blood, only Monza was still alive.